The early morning light spilled through the hotel room's gossamer curtains, casting delicate patterns across the rumpled white sheets. Carlos Navarro opened his eyes slowly, savoring that perfect moment of disorientation that comes with waking up in a foreign place. For a brief, beautiful second, his mind was gloriously empty, free from obligations, decisions, and the weight of family history. Then reality reassembled itself. Santorini. Greece. Vacation. Elena. He turned to his left, where Elena Martin, his fiancée of 6 months, slept peacefully beside him. Her chestnut hair spread across the pillow in elegant disarray, her olive skin glowing in the gentle Mediterranean light. Even asleep, she maintained that poised, almost curated appearance that had first drawn him to her at a gallery opening in Madrid 3 years ago. Carlos carefully extracted himself from the bed, trying not to disturb her. Tomorrow, his 30th birthday, marked the halfway point of their 2-week Greek island-hopping adventure. 7 days of sun-drenched bliss behind them, 7 more ahead, and then back to the controlled chaos of wedding preparations in Madrid. He padded quietly to the private terrace of their cliffside suite, the cool tile soothing against his bare feet. The panorama that greeted him never failed to steal his breath, the vast azure expanse of the Aegean stretching to the horizon, the dramatic caldera formed by an ancient volcanic eruption, whitewashed buildings cascading down steep cliffs like frozen foam. Below, the small harbor of Fira bustled with early morning activity as fishermen returned with their catches and the first ferry of the day prepared to depart. He leaned against the railing, inhaling the salt-scented air, and thought about how perfectly their lives were coming together. Elena's career as an architect was flourishing. His position as a history professor at Universidad Complutense provided stability and satisfaction. They'd recently found an apartment in Cambury, not yet within their budget, but something to aspire to, a goal that motivated their careful saving and planning. Everything followed the meticulous timeline they drafted together over numerous dinners and Sunday morning coffees. Contemplating jumping? Elena's voice, still husky with sleep, came from behind him. Carlos turned and smiled. Just wondering if I could fly. She joined him at the railing, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his shoulder. I wouldn't recommend testing that theory. I've grown rather attached to you. He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her jasmine shampoo. How did you sleep? Like a dream. I'm still not convinced this isn't one. She gestured toward the breathtaking view. How is this real, Carlos? How is this our life? We worked for it, he replied simply. We planned for it. Elena nodded, her expression shifting subtly. It was a look Carlos recognized, her mind already racing ahead to the next item on their agenda. Speaking of plans, we should get moving if we want to visit the archaeological site at Akrotiri before the crowds arrive. Carlos suppressed a small sigh. Elena's efficiency was one of her most admirable qualities, but sometimes, especially on vacation, he wished she could linger in moments like these. We have time for breakfast first, right? I saw that little bakery down the street yesterday with those spinach pastries you liked in Athens. She seemed to consider this deviation from their itinerary before nodding. Okay, but let's be quick. The tour buses usually arrive around 10. As they dressed and prepared for the day, Carlos found himself watching Elena with quiet affection. Her methodical way of applying sunscreen, the precise manner in which she packed their day bag, the careful consultation of their digital map, all part of the organized approach to life that balanced his more spontaneous tendencies. They complemented each other well. Everyone said so. Breakfast was hurried but delicious, the spanakopita still warm from the oven, the Greek coffee strong enough to jolt even Elena fully awake. They navigated the narrow, winding streets of Fira, dodging early rising tourists and locals setting up shop for the day. Carlos stopped occasionally to snap photos with his ancient film camera, a relic from his grandfather that Elena tolerated with amused patience. I still don't understand why you insist on using that dinosaur, she said as he carefully adjusted the aperture to capture an elderly Greek woman arranging vibrant flowers outside her door. Your phone camera has 10 times the resolution. It's not about resolution, Carlos replied, a conversation they'd had dozens of times. It's about intentionality. Having limited exposures makes you think before you shoot. Plus, there's something magical about not knowing exactly what you've captured until weeks later. Magical or inefficient? She teased, but without malice. Come on, Indiana Jones. Archaeology awaits. They caught the local bus to Akrotiri, an ancient Minoan settlement preserved in volcanic ash like a Bronze Age Pompeii. As they wandered through the remarkably preserved remains of a 3,600-year-old civilization, Carlos felt that familiar thrill that had drawn him to historical studies in the first place, the tangible connection to lives lived millennia ago, the humbling perspective of human existence against the vast canvas of time. Can you imagine? He murmured to Elena as they stood before the remains of a 3-story building. These walls have stood here since before Rome was even a village. The people who lived here traded with Egypt when the pharaohs were at the height of their power. Elena nodded appreciatively, though Carlos could tell her interest was more architectural than historical. The construction techniques are remarkable for the period. Look at how they reinforce the corners against seismic activity. They understood structural integrity in ways that wouldn't be rediscovered for thousands of years. They spent the morning exploring the site, then retreated to a small taverna for lunch as the midday heat intensified. Over grilled octopus and chilled white wine, their conversation drifted to wedding plans and the growing list of details still requiring attention when they returned to Spain. Your cousin Mateo still hasn't confirmed whether he's bringing a +1, Elena noted, scrolling through her phone. And we need to finalize the menu choices by the end of the month. I'll call him when we get back, Carlos promised, though part of him wished they could leave such concerns behind for the duration of their vacation. Have you heard back from the quartet you wanted for the ceremony? They're available, but they've increased their rate. Elena frowned slightly. It might be worth considering the trio instead. We could put the difference toward the Comberry apartment fund. The Comberry apartment, their shared dream and constant reference point when making financial decisions. Located in one of Madrid's most desirable neighborhoods, the pre-war building with its high ceilings and original moldings represented everything they aspire to: elegance, history, and careful investment in their future. They'd first viewed it 3 months ago, both instantly falling in love despite the price tag that stretched well beyond their current means. We'll make it work, Carlos assured her, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. The apartment will be ours eventually. I know, Elena smiled, but there was a hint of something in her expression, impatience, perhaps, or concern, that Carlos couldn't quite decipher. After lunch, they spent a leisurely afternoon on one of Santorini's black sand beaches, Elena reading an architectural journal on her tablet while Carlos alternated between swimming in the crystal clear water and making notes in his travel journal. By unspoken agreement, they avoided further discussion of wedding logistics or financial planning, instead surrendering to the tranquil rhythm of waves against shore in the gentle caress of the late afternoon sun. As dusk approached, they returned to their hotel to prepare for dinner. Carlos emerged from the shower to find Elena on the balcony, her phone pressed to her ear, speaking rapid Spanish in the clipped, professional tone she reserved for work matters. He dressed quietly, giving her privacy, but couldn't help overhearing fragments of conversation that suggested some issue with one of her Madrid projects. When she finally ended the call, her expression was tense. Is everything okay? He asked. Just a problem with the municipal permits for the Salamanca renovation, she said, waving dismissively though her frown remained. Nothing that can't wait until we're back. Carlos nodded, knowing better than to press. Elena was meticulous about separating work and personal time, another quality he admired, even if he sometimes found her compartmentalization a bit rigid. They dined that evening at a small, family-owned restaurant perched on the Caldere's edge, with a view of the sunset that drew appreciative gasps from every patron. The food was simple but exquisite, fresh fish grilled to perfection, local vegetables drizzled with olive oil pressed from groves just across the water on Crete, wine made from grapes grown in Santorini's volcanic soil. As twilight deepened into night and stars began to pepper the velvety sky, Carlos reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. I know your birthday isn't until tomorrow, Elena said, noticing the gesture, but I can't wait to give you your gift. She produced an elegantly wrapped package from her handbag. You first. Carlos accepted the package, carefully unwrapping it to reveal a vintage compass in a polished wooden case. The brass instrument gleamed in the candlelight, its needle quivering slightly before settling toward north. "It's 19th century," Elena explained. "English made. The dealer said it was used by a naval officer during the Crimean War. I thought it would complement your grandfather's camera, another anachronistic tool for the professor who lives half in the past." Her teasing tone was affectionate. "It's perfect," Carlos said sincerely, genuinely touched by how well she understood his appreciation for objects with history, with stories embedded in their very material. "Thank you." He handed her the small box, suddenly nervous. Inside was a pair of earrings he'd commissioned from a jeweler in Madrid, small, elegant studs featuring 2 tiny sapphires surrounded by seed pearls. "They're beautiful," Elena breathed, immediately removing her current earrings to replace them with his gift. "They're the same blue as the Aegean," Carlos explained. "I thought, whenever you wear them, you could remember this trip, this moment." Elena leaned across the table to kiss him, her eyes suspiciously bright in the candlelight. "Sometimes, beneath all that historical trivia, you're quite the romantic, Professor Navarro." They lingered over dessert, a shared portion of baklava dripping with honey and a small glass of sweet Vincente wine, before wandering back through Fair's nighttime labyrinth of narrow streets, now illuminated by strings of lights and the warm glow from shop windows and restaurant terraces. Back in the room, they made love with the windows open to the sea breeze, the distant sound of music from the harbor providing a gentle soundtrack. Afterward, as Elena drifted to sleep in his arms, Carlos found himself wide awake, filled with an inexplicable sense of anticipation, as if something significant waited just beyond the horizon of tomorrow. He carefully disentangled himself and returned to the terrace, settling into one of the loungers with his travel journal. The night was clear, the stars impossibly bright against the black velvet sky. In the distance, the lights of a cruise ship moved slowly across the horizon, like a constellation come loose from its moorings. Carlos opened his journal, his pen hovering over the blank page as he tried to capture the contentment he felt, the sense of being exactly where he was meant to be, with exactly the right person, at exactly the right moment in his life. Everything was unfolding according to plan, their plan. So why did he feel this strange undercurrent of unease, this whisper of something approaching that would upset the careful balance of their shared world? He dismissed the thought as mere pre-birthday melancholy, the inevitable stock-taking that comes with marking another year's passage. 30 was just a number, after all, not a cliff's edge. Carlos closed the journal without writing a word and returned to bed, curling himself around Elena's sleeping form. Tomorrow, he told himself as sleep finally claimed him, would be perfect. They had planned it that way. Chapter 2. The call. Carlos awoke to soft kisses along his jawline and the delicate aroma of freshly brewed coffee. He opened his eyes to find Elena sitting beside him on the bed, fully dressed and looking impossibly fresh, a breakfast tray balanced on her lap. "Happy birthday, sleepyhead," she said, her smile radiant in the morning light. "I let you sleep in. It's almost 9. Carlos pushed himself up against the pillows, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, gesturing toward the impressive spread on the tray, yogurt with honey and fresh fruit, pastries from the bakery they'd visited yesterday, and 2 cups of steaming coffee. "Of course I did. It's not every day my future husband turns 30. She leaned forward to kiss him properly. "Old man. Watch it," he warned playfully. "You're only 11 months behind me." 11 months and 23 days, she corrected with mock seriousness. "And I intend to make the most of them." They shared breakfast on the terrace, planning the day ahead. Elena had arranged a private boat tour around the caldera, followed by lunch at a vineyard on the island's less developed side. The evening would bring dinner at Santorini's most acclaimed restaurant, a reservation she'd secured months in advance. "You've thought of everything," Carlos said, genuinely touched by her attention to detail, the care she'd taken to make his birthday special. "Always," she replied with a wink. "Now hurry and get ready. The boat captain is meeting us at 11. Carlos showered quickly, his mind drifting to the previous evening's inexplicable sense of foreboding. In the bright light of morning, surrounded by Elena's thoughtful planning and obvious affection, those concerns seemed ridiculous. the product of too much wine and a peculiar melancholy that sometimes accompanied milestone birthdays. He was just stepping out of the bathroom, towel wrapped around his waist, when his phone vibrated on the nightstand. The screen displayed his mother's name, unusual, as they had agreed to minimize contact during the vacation except for emergencies. A flicker of concern passed through him as he answered. "Mama? Is everything okay? Carlos, my darling." His mother's voice carried that particular tone he recognized from childhood, the careful modulation that meant she was delivering difficult news. "I'm sorry to disturb your vacation." "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately alert. "Is it Papa?" No, your father is fine. It's your grandmother." Carlos felt his stomach tighten. Abuela Maria, his father's mother, was in her late 80s but had always seemed indomitable, a force of nature disguised as a diminutive Spanish grandmother. "She's in the hospital," his mother continued, her voice steady but tinged with worry. "Nothing immediately life-threatening, the doctors assure us. Her heart is showing some signs of strain, and they're keeping her for observation and tests." "I'll come home," Carlos said immediately, already mentally calculating the fastest route back to Madrid, to Toledo where his grandmother lived. "No, Mijillo, that's not necessary," his mother insisted. "The doctors are optimistic. But she's been asking for you. Put her on the phone. I want to speak with her. She's resting now. But there's something else." His mother hesitated. "It's about the house." The house. Two simple words that carried the weight of generations. Carlos sat heavily on the edge of the bed, suddenly understanding his mother's careful tone. Abuela Maria's house was a sprawling stone structure on the outskirts of Toledo, parts of it dating back to the 16th century. It had been in the Navarro family for 5 generations, passing from father to eldest son in an unbroken chain until Carlos's grandfather had no male heir, only Carlos's father and his 3 sisters. When Carlos's grandfather died, Maria had remained in the house, her legal ownership undisputed but understood as a stewardship for future generations. Carlos had spent every summer of his childhood there, roaming the extensive gardens, exploring the labyrinthine rooms filled with furniture and art collected over centuries, listening to his grandmother's stories of ancestors who had lived between those sturdy stone walls. The house was more than property. It was the physical embodiment of his family's history, a living archive of the Navarro legacy. "What about the house?" he asked, though something in him already knew. "Your grandmother has been approached with an offer to buy it," his mother explained. "A development company wants to convert it into a boutique hotel. They've made several offers over the past year, all of which Maria has rejected outright. But this latest one..." She paused. "It's substantial, Carlos. Very substantial." "She wouldn't sell," Carlos said with certainty. "She's always said the house stays in the family." "That's still her position," his mother confirmed, "but she's concerned about the future. Your father and I have our home in Madrid. Your aunts are scattered across Europe with their own established lives. You're the only one who's ever shown real attachment to the place, who understands its value beyond the monetary." Carlos closed his eyes, seeing the house clearly in his mind, the weathered stone facade covered in climbing roses, the central courtyard with its ancient olive tree, the library where he'd first discovered his love of history among leather-bound volumes that smelled of time itself. "What does she want me to do?" he asked finally. "She wants your opinion, your blessing perhaps. The money from the sale could provide significant inheritance for all her children and grandchildren. It's a practical consideration at her age." His mother's voice softened. "But Maria has never been entirely practical where that house is concerned. Much like you." Carlos noticed Elena standing in the doorway, her expression questioning. He gave her a reassuring nod as he continued the conversation. "Tell her I'll call tonight, when she's resting. And Mama, tell her not to worry. The house isn't going anywhere." After ending the call, he quickly explained the situation to Elena, expecting sympathy, perhaps suggestions for how to politely decline the developer's offer while ensuring his grandmother's comfort and security. Instead, Elena's reaction caught him completely off guard. "You should consider it, she said, her tone matter-of-fact. A sale of that magnitude could change everything for your family. Carlos stared at her, momentarily speechless. It's not about the money, he finally managed. That house has been in my family for generations. It's part of our heritage. Elena sat beside him on the bed, her expression softening though her words remained pragmatic. I understand the sentimental value, Carlos. But be realistic. Your grandmother is aging, and that house is enormous, a maintenance nightmare. Who will care for it when she's gone? Your parents have their life in Madrid. You certainly can't manage it from the city while teaching full-time. I haven't thought that far ahead, Carlos admitted, though this wasn't entirely true. In his most private thoughts, he'd always imagined finding a way to preserve the house, perhaps converting part of it into a small historical museum or educational center while maintaining the family's connection to it. Well, perhaps now is the time, Elena suggested gently. This developer's offer could provide financial security for your entire family. Think about it, your share alone might be enough for us to buy the Gumberry apartment outright, with money left over to invest in our future. Carlos felt a strange disconnect, as if they were suddenly speaking different languages. You want me to sell my family's ancestral home so we can buy an apartment in Madrid? Elena's expression shifted slightly, a fleeting shadow of impatience quickly masked. I'm merely pointing out that there are practical considerations here. That house represents capital that's currently just sitting there, benefiting no one. It benefits my grandmother, who lives there. It benefits me, knowing it exists, that there's continuity, a physical connection to my past. Carlos stood, suddenly restless. It's not just an asset on a balance sheet, Elena. I'm not suggesting it is, she countered, her tone cooling. But it's also not realistic to keep a property of that size in the family indefinitely just because of tradition. Times change. Families evolve. Practical decisions need to be made. Carlos felt a chasm opening between them, not just a disagreement, but a fundamental difference in values he hadn't recognized before. Had it always been there, lurking beneath their compatible daily rhythms and shared goals? Let's not argue about this now, he said finally, attempting to bridge the unexpected divide. It's my birthday, we have plans, and nothing needs to be decided immediately. Elena seemed to hesitate before nodding, her smile returning though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Of course. You're right. This is a conversation for another day, when we're back in Madrid and can consider all angles carefully. She stood, smoothing her already immaculate sundress. We should get going if we want to meet the boat captain on time. Carlos dressed quickly, the excited anticipation of his birthday celebration now tempered by the morning's unexpected developments. As they walked toward the harbor, Elena slipped her hand into his, and he squeezed it gratefully, the familiar pressure reassuring. The boat tour was objectively perfect, a sleek private vessel navigating the Caldeira's deep blue waters, a knowledgeable captain pointing out geological features and historical sites, a light lunch of local delicacies served on deck as they anchored in a secluded cove for swimming. Elena took dozens of photos with her phone, capturing Carlos against the backdrop of Santorini's dramatic cliffs, both of them laughing as they jumped from the boat into the cool Mediterranean. Yet beneath the surface pleasures of the day, Carlos felt a subtle current of tension. Several times, he caught Elena looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret, speculative, perhaps, or calculating. Their conversation remained deliberately light, focusing on immediate experiences and avoiding any mention of his grandmother's house or the developer's offer. By the time they returned to the harbor in late afternoon, Carlos had almost convinced himself that their earlier discord had been a minor misunderstanding, already fading in the warm glow of a perfect birthday. We have a couple of hours before our dinner reservation, Elena noted as they climbed the steep path back to their hotel. I thought I might do some yoga on the terrace if you don't mind. I skipped my morning routine with all the birthday preparations. Of course, Carlos agreed easily. I'll call my grandmother, then maybe work on my journal for a bit. In the room, Elena changed into her exercise clothes while Carlos stepped onto the balcony for privacy, dialing his grandmother's number. The hospital room phone rang several times before being answered by his Aunt Lucia, who confirmed that Abuela Maria was doing well, resting comfortably after a battery of tests. "She's right here," Lucia said, awake now and eager to speak with you. His grandmother's voice, when she came on the line, was frailer than Carlos remembered. It still carried that unmistakable note of determined cheer. "My boy," she greeted him, "what a waste of a telephone call to an old woman when you should be enjoying your Greek adventures." "It's never a waste to talk to you, Abuela," Carlos replied, smiling despite his concern. "How are you feeling?" "Truly? Oh, this old heart has been beating for 87 years. It can manage a few more." She dismissed her condition with characteristic nonchalance. "Your mother told you about the house, I suppose?" "Yes," Carlos confirmed. "But you don't need to worry about that now. Focus on getting better. At my age, mi carino, there's no time to postpone important conversations." Her tone grew more serious. "This company has been very persistent. The amount they're offering now, it would secure the financial future of all my children and grandchildren." Carlos leaned against the balcony railing, watching a ferry glide across the caldera toward the horizon. "Money isn't everything, Abuela." "No, it isn't," she agreed with surprising readiness. "That's why I've refused their previous offers. But I won't be here forever, Carlos, and I need to consider what happens after I'm gone." "The house stays in the family," Carlos said firmly. "As it always has." "But who in the family wants it?" his grandmother asked gently. "Your father is established in Madrid. Your aunts have their own homes in Barcelona, Paris, and London. Your cousins are scattered even further. You're the only one who has ever truly loved the house for itself, not just as a place of childhood memories." Carlos closed his eyes, picturing the room where his grandmother had slept for more than 60 years, the heavy wooden bed frame that had witnessed births and deaths, the Madonna icon in the corner that had watched over generations of Navarros, the window that framed Toledo's ancient skyline in the distance. "I do love it," he admitted, "but Abuela, don't make any decisions about selling while you're in the hospital. These developers can wait. The house has been in our family since before Napoleon's troops marched through Toledo," she replied, a hint of her usual steely resolve returning. "It has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, survived civil war and dictatorship. It won't be sold without careful consideration." She paused. "But Carlos, mi vida, I need to know your thoughts. If the money from the sale could guarantee your future, your children's future, would that be a price worth paying for letting go of stone and mortar?" "The house is more than stone and mortar," Carlos protested. "It's our history, our roots. History lives in people, not places, my darling boy." His grandmother's voice was gentle but firm. "The stories we tell, the values we pass down, those survive with or without the physical walls that once contained them." Carlos was silent, struck by the unexpected philosophical turn in his practical grandmother's thinking. "Think about it," she continued. "Not just with your heart, which I know is already decided, but with your mind as well. Consider what this money could mean for your future with Elena, for the family you'll build together." "I will, Abuela," he promised, though he already knew his answer wouldn't change. "But now you need to rest and recover. We can discuss this properly when I'm back in Spain." They exchanged a few more minutes of conversation, his grandmother insisting he describe Santorini in detail, exclaiming with delight at his account of the caldera and the black sand beaches, before Carlos heard a nurse in the background announcing the end of visiting hours. "I must go," his grandmother said reluctantly. "Happy birthday, my Carlos. 30 years ago today, I held you in my arms for the first time in the very house we're discussing. Remember that, whatever you decide." The call ended, leaving Carlos with a lump in his throat and the weight of family history pressing on his shoulders. He remained on the balcony, watching the sun begin its spectacular descent toward the horizon, casting long golden rays across the whitewashed buildings cascading down to the sea. Behind him, he heard the door to the room open and close. He turned to find Elena, still in her yoga clothes, a sheen of perspiration on her forehead. "How was she?" Elena asked, her tone solicitous though something in her expression remained guarded. "Stable," Carlos replied, putting on a brave face, as always. Elena nodded, hesitating before asking the question Carlos could see forming behind her eyes. And the house? Did she mention it? Yes. Carlos turned back to the view, suddenly reluctant to revisit their earlier disagreement. She wanted my opinion on the developer's offer. And? Elena prompted when he didn't continue. Carlos sighed. And I told her not to make any decisions while she's in the hospital. That we can discuss it when I'm back in Spain. He felt rather than saw Elena move to stand beside him, her presence both familiar and suddenly enigmatic, as if the events of the day had cast her in a slightly different light. What would you do? He asked abruptly, turning to face her. If it were your family's home, your heritage at stake, what would you choose? Elena considered for a moment, her gaze direct. I would recognize that heritage isn't just about preserving the past exactly as it was. Sometimes honoring your family means using inherited resources to build something new, something better for the next generation. That's not really answering the question, Carlos observed. Yes, I would sell, Elena stated plainly. I would take that money and invest it in a future that offers security and opportunity, rather than pouring it into maintaining a shrine to the past that serves no practical purpose. The bluntness of her response startled him, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Elena had always been practical, forward-looking, unencumbered by what she sometimes gently teased were his sentimental attachments to history. The house isn't a shrine, he countered. It's a living connection to my ancestors, to who I am. Carlos. Elena's voice softened as she took his hands in hers. You are not defined by a building. Your intelligence, your kindness, your values, those come from within you and from the people who raised you, not from stone walls and antique furniture. Put that way, his attachment to the house seemed childish, irrational, yet he couldn't shake the visceral certainty that selling it would be a betrayal of his grandmother's trust, of generations of Navarros who had preserved it through wars and hardship, of some essential part of himself. I need to think, he said finally. This isn't a decision to be made lightly or quickly. Of course, Elena agreed, squeezing his hands before releasing them. But while you're thinking, consider this, that Conberry apartment we both fell in love with, the one that's just beyond our budget? Your share of this sale could make it ours immediately. No more years of saving, no more compromises on location or size. Our dream home, Carlos, ready and waiting for us to begin our married life. The image was undeniably appealing, the sun-filled rooms with their original moldings, the balcony overlooking the tree-lined street, the space that would comfortably accommodate the children they discussed having within a few years. Yet the thought of purchasing it with money from selling his grandmother's house left an ashen taste in his mouth. We don't need the Conberry apartment, he said slowly. We want it, yes, but we can find somewhere else, somewhere that fits our current budget. Something flickered in Elena's eyes, disappointment, perhaps, or a sharper emotion quickly masked. Of course we can, she agreed, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. I'm just pointing out one of many possibilities this opportunity creates. An opportunity. That was how Elena saw it, a fortuitous chance to accelerate their carefully constructed plans, to leap ahead in the life they were building together. Why couldn't he see it the same way? We should prepare for dinner, Elena said, smoothly changing the subject. I've laid out your blue linen shirt, the one that matches my dress. As they dressed in companionable silence, Carlos tried to recapture the uncomplicated happiness of the morning, the simple joy of celebrating his birthday with the woman he loved in one of the world's most beautiful settings. Yet his mother's call had altered something fundamental, like a pebble creating ripples that gradually transformed the surface of a still pond. Dinner at the acclaimed clifftop restaurant was objectively perfect, inventive cuisine that reinterpreted traditional Greek dishes, impeccable service, a table positioned to witness the island's famous sunset in all its chromatic glory. They toasted with vintage champagne, took the obligatory photographs of each spectacular course, and engaged in the kind of light, pleasant conversation that characterizes special occasions. Yet beneath it all, Carlos felt a subtle but persistent discord, like a single instrument slightly out of tune in an otherwise harmonious orchestra. Each time he caught Elena looking at him with that speculative expression, each moment when their conversation carefully avoided any mention of his grandmother's house or their earlier disagreement, the dissonance grew more noticeable. By the time they returned to their hotel, pleasantly satiated with fine food and wine, The unspoken tension between them had developed a presence of its own, a third entity accompanying them through the moonlit streets of Fira. In the room, as Elena removed her earrings, the sapphire studs he'd given her the previous evening, she finally broke the careful silence they'd maintained throughout dinner. "You're going to refuse the offer, aren't you?" she asked, meeting his gaze in the mirror's reflection. "No matter how substantial it is, no matter what opportunities it might create for us." Carlos sighed, loosening his tie. "It's not about refusing the money, Elena. It's about preserving something irreplaceable. Once the house leaves our family, that connection is severed forever." "Connections evolve," she countered, turning to face him directly. "New ones form. That's how life progresses." "Some things should be preserved," Carlos insisted. "Some continuity maintained." Elena studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Did you know," she said finally, "that when the ancient Greeks built a new temple, they often incorporated stones from the old one? They understood that preservation doesn't have to mean keeping everything exactly as it was. Sometimes it means carrying forward the most valuable elements while allowing the form to evolve." The metaphor was elegant, precisely the kind of reasoned argument that Elena excelled at constructing. Yet it missed the essential point that Carlos couldn't quite articulate, the visceral certainty that his grandmother's house needed to remain intact, in the family, a living repository of Navarro history rather than a collection of elements to be selectively preserved. "It's not the same," he said simply. "No," Elena agreed, her tone cooling slightly. "It's not. Because stones and buildings are just objects, Carlos. What matters is what we build with them, the lives we create moving forward." She turned away, her movements precise as she removed her makeup, changed into her night clothes, performed her bedtime routine with characteristic efficiency. Carlos awoke to an empty bed. The space beside him, where Elena should have been, retained a slight impression but no warmth. She'd been up for some time. Sunlight streamed through the partially open curtains, painting stripes across the rumpled sheets. He squinted at his watch, 8:37 a.m. Not particularly late, but later than Elena typically allowed herself to sleep, even on vacation. The events of the previous day came rushing back: his birthday, his grandmother's hospitalization, the unexpected revelation about the house, and most disturbingly, the glimpse into a side of Elena he hadn't fully recognized before. Their conversation had ended in an uneasy truce, neither willing to concede but both reluctant to push the disagreement further on what was supposed to be a celebration. Carlos sat up, running a hand through his disheveled hair as he glanced around the room. Elena's phone charger remained plugged in by her side of the bed, her novels played open on the nightstand, small reassurances that she hadn't gone far. The bathroom door stood ajar, the space beyond it dark and empty. He pulled on a t-shirt and stepped out onto the terrace, expecting to find her there with her morning coffee, perhaps performing her customary yoga routine. The terrace was empty, though a single cup sat on the small table, lipstick on the rim, the coffee inside grown cold. A flicker of concern passed through him. It wasn't like Elena to leave without a note, without a plan communicated and agreed upon. Their entire relationship operated on shared information, coordinated schedules, and mutual awareness of each other's whereabouts, not from any possessive impulse but from the practical efficiency that Elena valued so highly. Carlos returned inside and grabbed his phone. No messages, no missed calls. He dialed Elena's number, listening as it rang several times before connecting to voicemail. Her voice, professional, measured, with just a touch of warmth at the edges, instructed him to leave a message. "Hey, it's me," he said after the beep, keeping his tone light. "Just wondering where you've disappeared to this morning. Call me when you get this." He showered quickly, trying to ignore the growing unease in his stomach. By the time he dressed, there was still no word from Elena, no response to his message. The knot of concern tightened. Her absence was beginning to feel less like a spontaneous morning excursion and more like... what? A statement? A protest? He wasn't sure. Carlos headed down to the hotel's breakfast terrace, scanning the scattered tables for Elena's familiar figure. She wasn't there. The hostess greeted him with a bright smile. "Good morning, Mr. Navarro. Just yourself today?" My fiancée hasn't been down for breakfast, has she? Carlos asked. The hostess consulted her tablet. No, sir. Would you like to wait for her, or shall I seat you now? I'll wait, thank you. Carlos moved to the terrace railing, gazing out over Santorini's breathtaking caldera view, the deep blue water, the craggy volcanic islands, the whitewashed buildings cascading down the cliffs like frozen foam. Under different circumstances, the sight would have filled him with tranquility. Now, it merely provided a backdrop for his mounting worry. He tried Elena's phone again. Straight to voicemail this time. The knot in his stomach twisted further. Carlos approached the reception desk, where a young Greek woman greeted him with a professional smile. Excuse me, he began, my fiancée seems to have gone out early this morning. I was wondering if perhaps she left a message for me? The receptionist's smile faltered slightly. Your room number, sir? 412. She tapped at her computer, then looked up with an apologetic expression. I'm sorry, Mr. Navarro. I don't see any messages left for your room. She didn't happen to mention where she was going when she left? Tall woman, dark hair? She would have been speaking Spanish or English. Another tap at the keyboard. I'm afraid I wasn't on duty when she departed. Let me check with my colleague who worked the night shift. She made a brief phone call in rapid Greek, listened, then returned her attention to Carlos. Ms. Morton left the hotel around 6 this morning. She didn't leave any messages with the staff. 6 in the morning. Elena had always been an early riser, but this was extreme even for her, especially on vacation. Thank you, Carlos said, forcing a smile. I'm sure she'll be back soon. He returned to the breakfast terrace, where the hostess seated him at a table with a prime view of both the caldera and the entrance, allowing him to keep watch for Elena's return. He ordered coffee but found himself too preoccupied to eat, checking his phone every few minutes for messages that didn't come. By 10 o'clock, Carlos had abandoned any pretense of enjoying a leisurely breakfast. Elena had been gone for 4 hours with no communication, completely out of character for someone who typically updated him on her whereabouts with almost military precision. Something was wrong. He paid his bill and was heading back to the room when his phone finally buzzed with an incoming text message. Carlos fumbled it from his pocket, relief washing over him at the sight of Elena's name on the screen. The relief was short-lived. I need space to think. We need to talk about your decision and what it means for our future. Meet me at Moody Bay at 1 p.m. No explanation for her disappearance, no apology for the worry she must have known she'd cause him. Just a terse instruction and an ominous reference to your decision, as if he'd already made a definitive choice about his grandmother's house, as if that choice somehow imperiled their shared future. Carlos stared at the message, reading and rereading it as he tried to reconcile this cold communique with the woman he thought he knew. Where was the consideration, the careful coordination that had characterized their 3 years together? Where was the woman who'd arranged his perfect birthday celebration just yesterday? He typed a reply, deleted it, started again. I've been worried. Where have you been all morning? 3 dots appeared immediately, indicating Elena was typing a response. They pulsed for several seconds before vanishing without a message appearing. Carlos waited, watching the screen, but nothing came through. After 5 minutes, he tried again. Elena, I don't understand what's happening here. Are you okay? The dots appeared and disappeared again. No response. I'll meet you at Moody Bay at 1. We can talk then. This time, there was no indication she was typing at all. Carlos waited another 5 minutes before shoving his phone back into his pocket with a frustrated sigh. Whatever was happening, Elena clearly wasn't interested in explaining herself via text message. He'd have to wait until their meeting to understand what was going on. The intervening hours stretched interminably. Carlos returned to the room, half hoping to find Elena there, having reconsidered her dramatic exit. The room remained empty, undisturbed since housekeeping had made the bed and refreshed the towels. He paced the terrace, alternating between concern for Elena's well-being and irritation at her uncharacteristic behavior. This wasn't how they operated, wasn't the careful, considerate partnership they built. Even in their rare disagreements, they maintained open lines of communication, explain their feelings, work toward resolution together. By noon, Carlos's anxiety had crystallized into a cold certainty that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. Elena's reaction to the house situation seemed disproportionate, revealing priorities he hadn't fully recognized before. Still, he couldn't imagine that a single disagreement, however significant, could derail 3 years of harmony and shared plans. He left the hotel early, allowing himself ample time for the journey to a moody bay. The small harbor lay at the bottom of a steep cliff below Oa, accessible either by a winding road or a long staircase of nearly 300 steps. Carlos opted for the stairs, needing the physical exertion to burn off his restless energy. The descent was punishing in the early afternoon heat, the sun beating mercilessly on his back as he navigated the uneven stone steps. Donkeys laden with tourists passed him, climbing upward with patient determination. The bay gradually came into view, a tiny horseshoe of brilliant blue water surrounded by volcanic rock, lined with a handful of tavernas whose terraces extended out over the sea. Carlos reached the bottom with 20 minutes to spare, his shirt damp with perspiration, his mood darkened by the oppressive heat and his growing sense of foreboding. He selected one of the tavernas, requesting a table for two on the water's edge, and ordered a bottle of cold water while he waited. At precisely 1 o'clock, Elena appeared at the bottom of the staircase. Even from a distance, Carlos could see she had taken pains with her appearance, hair smoothly styled despite the heat, a crisp white sundress that accentuated her olive skin, large sunglasses obscuring her eyes. She paused, scanning the tavernas before spotting him. Her posture straightened almost imperceptibly as she approached, reminiscent of the professional demeanor she adopted for difficult client meetings. Carlos stood as she reached the table, unsure whether to embrace her, kiss her, or maintain the formal distance her body language seemed to request. He settled for pulling out her chair. "Thank you," Elena said, her voice coolly polite as she took the seat. She removed her sunglasses, folding them carefully beside her plate, and met his gaze directly. "Where have you been?" Carlos asked without preamble. "I've been worried." "I needed to clear my head," she replied. "I went for a walk along the Caldera path to Oa, then took the bus to the Black Beach at Parisa. I needed space to think." "You could have left a note," Carlos pointed out, struggling to keep the edge from his voice. "Or answered my calls." "You're right. I should have." Elena's acknowledgement came without apology, a mere statement of fact. "I wasn't in the right frame of mind for conversation until I'd sorted through my thoughts." A waiter approached, offering menus. Elena smoothly ordered a Greek salad and sparkling water without looking at the options. Carlos, his appetite diminished by tension, requested the same. When they were alone again, Elena folded her hands on the table, her engagement ring catching the sunlight. The 3-carat diamond had been her choice, larger than Carlos would have selected independently, but still within the budget they'd agreed upon. Like every other financial decision in their relationship, "I've spent the morning thinking about us," she began, her tone measured, "about our plans, our future, and what yesterday's conversation revealed." "Elena," Carlos interrupted, "it was one disagreement about a family matter. I don't understand why you're treating this like some kind of crisis." She held up a hand, stopping him. "Please, let me finish. This isn't about a single disagreement. It's about what that disagreement revealed about our fundamental values, our priorities." She paused, selecting her words with obvious care. "I've always known you had a romantic attachment to history, to your family's past. It's part of what drew me to you, that passion, that connection to something larger than yourself." Carlos waited, sensing there was more, a qualification coming. "But I always assumed it was an intellectual passion, an academic interest, not something that would influence major life decisions in impractical ways." Elena's gaze was steady, unflinching. "Yesterday showed me otherwise. You're willing to reject a financial opportunity that could secure our future, that could give us everything we've planned for, because of sentiment. Because a building has been in your family for generations." "It's not just a building," Carlos objected. "It's a legacy, a trust." "It's stone and mortar," Elena countered, her voice still calm though her knuckles whitened where her hands remained clasped on the table. "It's an asset that could be converted into security, opportunity, freedom." and you're allowing emotional attachment to cloud your judgment, to potentially sacrifice our future together." The waiter returned with their salads and drinks. Carlos barely noticed, focused entirely on the woman across from him, this familiar stranger whose priorities seemed suddenly alien. "Our future doesn't depend on selling my grandmother's house," he said when they were alone again. "We've been planning carefully, saving diligently. The Cranberry apartment might take longer to achieve, but it's not just about the apartment," Elena interrupted. "It's about what this reveals about how you make decisions. About whether sentiment will always override practicality in matters that affect us both." Carlos felt a surge of frustration. "This is my family's home we're talking about, not some investment property. And the decision affects my entire family, not just us. My grandmother, my parents, my aunts, they all have connections to that house. I can't unilaterally decide to sever those connections for financial gain. Your grandmother is the legal owner, and she's asking for your input because she knows you're the only one with this attachment." Elena picked up her fork but made no move to eat. "The rest of your family is ready to move forward, to use this resource to build better futures. You're the only one clinging to the past at the expense of the present." "You don't know that," Carlos argued. "You haven't spoken to them." "I don't need to. Your mother called your grandmother's house a practical consideration. Your father has built his life in Madrid, not Toledo. Your aunts are scattered across Europe. No one is stepping forward to preserve this sacred family monument except you, Carlos. And you're willing to place that obligation above our plans, our future." The unfairness of this characterization stung. "I haven't even made a decision yet," he protested. "I told my grandmother we'd discuss it when I returned to Spain. We can talk about it together, consider all options, but I already know what you'll decide," Elena interrupted. "I saw it in your face yesterday. You'll reject the offer, maintain the status quo, and expect our plans to simply adapt around this anchor to the past." Carlos stared at her, truly seeing her for perhaps the first time. The woman he loved, the woman he'd planned to marry, viewed his family's ancestral home, a place central to his identity, his sense of belonging, as nothing more than an anchor, a burden to be shed for financial advantage. "What exactly are you saying, Elena?" he asked, his voice low. "That if I don't agree to sell my grandmother's house, our relationship is in jeopardy?" She met his gaze unflinchingly. "I'm saying that this situation has revealed a fundamental incompatibility in how we approach major life decisions. I plan methodically, weighing practical considerations and future benefits. You make emotional choices based on tradition and sentiment, even when they conflict with our shared goals." "That's not fair," Carlos objected. "I've always been practical about our life together, our finances, our plans. This is one situation where other considerations come into play: family history, cultural heritage, my grandmother's wishes." "One situation now," Elena agreed. "But what about the next time your sentiment conflicts with our practical needs? What about when we have children, and decisions about their education or our living situation arise? Will family tradition always trump what's best for our future?" Carlos felt as if the ground beneath him had suddenly shifted, revealing a chasm he hadn't known existed. "I can't believe we're having this conversation," he said finally. "Yesterday we were celebrating my birthday, planning our wedding, talking about our future children. Today you're questioning whether we're compatible at all because of one disagreement about my family's property." Elena's expression softened slightly. "I don't want to end our relationship, Carlos. I love you, but I need to know that we share the same values, the same priorities, especially when it comes to major decisions that affect our future together." "And if we don't?" he challenged. "If I decide that keeping my grandmother's house in the family is important to me? If I'm not willing to convert every emotional attachment, every family connection into a financial calculation, then I would have to reconsider whether we're truly compatible for a lifetime partnership," Elena said, her voice steady despite the devastating implication of her words. Carlos felt as if he'd been struck. "Are you giving me an ultimatum? Sell the house or lose you?" "I'm being honest about what this decision represents to me," she replied. about what it reveals regarding our compatibility. Their salads remained untouched between them, wilting in the afternoon heat. In the water beside their table, small boats bobbed gently on the incoming tide, fishermen preparing for their evening work. This scene was absurdly idyllic for the conversation unfolding within it. "I need you to understand something," Carlos said finally, leaning forward. "That house isn't just property to me. When I was 7 years old, my grandfather took me into the library and showed me journals kept by my ancestors dating back to the 18th century. He told me that someday, that history would be my responsibility to preserve. When he died the following year, my grandmother continued that tradition, teaching me about every room, every artifact, every story embedded in those walls. It's not sentimentality, Elena. It's a trust, a responsibility I've been prepared for my entire life. A responsibility that will consume resources we could use to build our own future, our own stories," Elena countered. "I understand what the house means to you, Carlos. What I need you to understand is what it would mean for us, the opportunity sacrificed, the finances strained, the practical burdens assumed in service of preserving a past that, frankly, has little relevance to our life together." Carlos shook his head, a sense of resigned clarity settling over him. "If you truly understood what the house means to me, you wouldn't frame it as a choice between the past and our future. It's part of who I am, Elena. If you're asking me to sever that connection, you're asking me to become someone else." "Perhaps I am," she admitted quietly. "Perhaps I'm asking you to prioritize the man you're becoming, the partner you're going to be, over the child who was given an impossible responsibility by well-meaning but impractical grandparents." The dismissive characterization of his grandparents, of the values they'd instilled in him, struck Carlos with physical force. He pushed back from the table slightly, creating distance between himself and this woman who suddenly seemed like a stranger. "I think we need some space," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "This conversation isn't productive right now. We're both upset, saying things we might regret." Elena studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Perhaps you're right. I have some more thinking to do as well." She reached into her handbag and withdrew an envelope, placing it carefully beside her untouched salad. "I've booked myself on tomorrow morning's ferry to Athens. I need to return to Madrid early to deal with the Salamanca project situation. I've left her half of the hotel payment in cash. It's paid through the end of our planned stay." Carlos stared at the envelope, comprehension dawning slowly. "You're leaving? Tomorrow? Without me?" "I think it's best if we have some real space to consider what we want," Elena replied. "You can finish your vacation as planned. The return flight I booked for us is still valid. You can take it at the end of the week, or change it if you prefer." The calculated practicality of her departure, already planned and arranged while he'd been worrying about her whereabouts, felt like a betrayal more profound than their disagreement about the house. "So that's it?" Carlos asked, anger finally breaking through his careful composure. "You've unilaterally decided that our 3-year relationship, our engagement, our planned future together hinges entirely on my decision about my grandmother's house? And rather than work through this together, you're simply leaving?" "I'm giving us both space to decide what we truly want," Elena corrected, her professional demeanor firmly in place despite the personal implosion occurring between them. "Sometimes distance provides clarity." "What clarity do you need, Elena?" "You've made your position perfectly clear. You want me to sell my family's ancestral home so we can buy an apartment in Conbury. You view my connection to my heritage as childish sentimentality that threatens our practical future together. What more is there to consider?" A flicker of emotion, hurt, perhaps, or frustration, crossed Elena's face before she regained her composure. "That's a simplistic characterization of my position, but I can see you're too upset for a productive conversation right now. Which confirms that some time apart is the right decision." She stood, gathering her handbag and sunglasses with fluid efficiency. "I'll sleep in the second bedroom of our suite tonight. My ferry leaves at 7 tomorrow morning. If you'd like to continue this discussion before then, I'll be available. If not, I understand." Carlos remained seated, momentarily stunned by the clinical precision with which Elena was dismantling what he thought was an unshakable relationship. Will you at least answer one question honestly? He asked as she prepared to leave. She paused, waiting. Did you plan this before my birthday? Before we knew about my grandmother's situation? Was there already something wrong with us that I didn't see? Elena's expression softened slightly. No, Carlos, I was happy with our relationship, our plans. But yesterday's conversation revealed something fundamental about you, about us, that I can't simply ignore or wish away. She hesitated, then added more gently, I do love you. That hasn't changed. But love isn't always enough for a successful partnership. Before he could respond, she was gone, moving with characteristic grace through the taverna and up the winding path toward Oya, her white dress a diminishing beacon against the volcanic rock. Carlos remained at the table, staring at the envelope containing his share of the hotel payment, a practical consideration, perfectly in character for Elena even in the midst of emotional devastation. His salad sat untouched, his water warming in the afternoon sun. Beyond the taverna's edge, the sea continued its eternal rhythm against the shore, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beside it. A heaviness settled in his chest, something between grief and disbelief. How had a single day, a single conversation about his grandmother's house, revealed such a fundamental rift between them? Had it always been there, lurking beneath their compatible routines and shared ambitions? Or had the house situation merely provided a convenient exit point for a woman already harboring doubts? The waiter approached hesitantly. Is everything all right with your meal, sir? Carlos looked up, momentarily disoriented by the mundane question in the midst of his personal earthquake. Yes, fine. I'm just not hungry. Could I have the check, please? He paid for their uneaten lunch and began the long climb back up the cliff stairs, each step an effort against the afternoon heat and his own leaden spirits. By the time he reached the top, his shirt was soaked with perspiration, his legs trembling with exertion. He found a bench in the shade and collapsed onto it, gulping from his water bottle as he stared out over the caldera. The view that had enchanted him just days ago now seemed like a cruel mockery, beauty unchanged while his world disintegrated. Somewhere on this island, Elena was. What? Packing her belongings? Making travel arrangements? Reconsidering her position? He couldn't imagine her doing the latter. Once Elena made a decision, she rarely reversed course. It was one of the qualities he'd always admired in her, her clarity of purpose, her unwavering commitment to a chosen path. Now that same quality was directing her away from him, away from their shared future, all because he couldn't treat his family's ancestral home as a mere financial asset to be liquidated for practical advantage. Carlos pulled out his phone, intending to call his mother, to update her on his grandmother's situation, to seek some grounding perspective on the house and Elena's reaction. His finger hovered over the call button before he put the phone away. What would he say? That his fiancée was leaving him because he wouldn't sell the family home? That 3 years of love and shared plans had collapsed in a single day over a disagreement about property? It sounded absurd even in his own mind. There had to be more to Elena's reaction, something deeper he wasn't seeing. Carlos caught a local bus back to Fara, the winding coastal road offering spectacular vistas that he barely registered. In their hotel room, there was no sign of Elena. Her suitcase remained in the closet, her toiletries arranged with characteristic precision in the bathroom, but the woman herself was absent. The second bedroom door stood open, the bed still made. She hadn't returned to the hotel yet. He sat on the terrace, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, casting long golden rays across the whitewashed buildings and deep blue sea. Ordinarily, he would have been captivated by the spectacular play of light, perhaps setting up his grandfather's old film camera to capture it. Now, he merely observed it with detached awareness, his mind circling endlessly around the conversation at a moody bay. An ultimatum. Elena hadn't framed it that way explicitly, but the message was clear: choose the practical paths she endorsed, or lose her. Choose financial advantage over family heritage, or watch the relationship dissolve. When had their values diverged so dramatically? Had they always been this far apart, their fundamental approaches to life masked by surface compatibility and careful compromise? Or had the house situation merely illuminated a growing divide, a natural evolution as they moved from the early romance of the relationship into the more complex negotiations of shared life decisions? Carlos didn't know. What he did know was that he couldn't simply dismiss his connection to his grandmother's house as childish sentimentality, couldn't reduce generations of family history to a financial calculation. And if Elena truly couldn't understand that, perhaps she was right about their incompatibility. The thought sent a wave of cold dread through him. 3 years. 3 years of shared experiences, intimate knowledge, carefully constructed plans for a future together, all potentially ending over a disagreement about property. It seemed simultaneously trivial and profound, a surface dispute that revealed oceanic depths of difference beneath. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the caldera in fiery hues of orange and gold, Carlos heard the door to the suite open. Elena's familiar footsteps crossed the living area, pausing briefly before continuing toward the second bedroom. Carlos remained on the terrace, unsure whether to acknowledge her presence or maintain the distance she had requested. After several minutes, the door to the terrace slid open. Elena stepped out, changed now into linen pants and a simple blouse, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She held 2 glasses of wine, offering one to Carlos with a tentative gesture that seemed at odds with her earlier certainty. "Peace offering," she said softly. Not to change the subject or avoid the conversation, but perhaps to have it without quite so much tension. Carlos accepted the glass, surprised by this conciliatory approach after her clinical departure from the taverna. "Thank you." Elena took the opposite chair, her gaze drawn to the spectacular sunset unfolding before them. "I always forget how beautiful it is here," she murmured. "No matter how many photos you see, they never capture it properly." "Some things can't be reduced to an image," Carlos agreed, aware of the potential metaphor but not pressing it. They sat in silence for several minutes, sipping their wine as the sun completed its descent, the sky transitioning from fiery orange to deep purple. The first stars appeared, pinpricks of light in the darkening canopy above the caldera. "I've been thinking about what you said," Elena began finally, her voice measured. "About the house being a trust, a responsibility you've been prepared for all your life." Carlos nodded, waiting. "I want you to know that I do understand its significance to you," she continued. "What I struggle with is reconciling that significance with the practical implications for our future together. The financial burden of maintaining a property of that size and age. The geographical complication of a second home several hours from Madrid. The resources, time, money, energy, that would be diverted from building our own life together." "I understand those concerns," Carlos acknowledged. "They're valid practical considerations that would need to be addressed. But Elena, there are solutions that don't involve selling the house outright. Partial conversion to a revenue-generating space, historical preservation grants, family cost-sharing arrangements, options we could explore together." Elena's expression remained skeptical. "Even with such arrangements, the house would represent a significant ongoing commitment, a commitment that would inevitably affect our plans, our financial freedom, our ability to build the life we've envisioned together." "Plans can evolve," Carlos suggested gently. "Our vision for the future isn't set in stone." "But that's just it," Elena replied, leaning forward. "I thought we had a shared vision. A clear path forward that we'd crafted together, carefully and deliberately. The Conberry apartment. Your associate professorship. My partnership track at the firm. Children in a few years, once our careers were established and our financial situation secure." She paused, her wine glass cradled between her hands. Now it seems that vision was incomplete. It didn't account for this obligation to your family's past that apparently takes precedence over our future. The unfairness of this characterization stung. "It's not about precedence, Elena. It's about finding a way to honor both commitments, to my family's legacy and to our future together. I'm not choosing one over the other." "But you are," she insisted. "By rejecting a solution that would secure our future, you are choosing sentiment over practicality, past over future." "And that's your right," she added quickly as Carlos began to object. "The house is your family's, not mine. But I need to be clear about what that choice means for us, for the life we've planned." Carlos set his wine glass on the small table between them, struggling to articulate the conviction that burned within him. Elena, if I sold that house for money, even money that benefited us directly, I would be betraying something fundamental about who I am, about the values I was raised with. Would you really want to build a future with someone who could discard their principles so easily? Principles, Elena repeated, a note of frustration entering her voice. Is it principle to maintain an aging property out of sentiment while passing up an opportunity to secure your financial future? Is it principle to allow emotional attachment to override practical considerations that would benefit your entire family, including future generations? There are different kinds of principles, different kinds of benefits, Carlos replied. Not all value can be measured in euros or square meters in fashionable neighborhoods. Elena studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. I think this is where we fundamentally differ, she said finally. I believe in building for the future, in making decisions that create security and opportunity going forward. You seem equally committed to preserving the past, maintaining traditions and connections even at practical cost. I don't see those approaches as mutually exclusive, Carlos argued. We can honor the past while building toward the future. They're complementary, not contradictory. In theory, perhaps, Elena conceded. But in practice, specific choices must be made. Resources allocated. Priorities established. She set down her wine glass, her decision apparently made. I'm still leaving tomorrow, Carlos. I think we both need time to consider what we truly want, what compromises we're willing to make, or not make, for our relationship. Carlos felt a surge of frustration at her intransigence. So nothing has changed. You're still presenting me with an implicit choice, the house or you. I'm acknowledging a reality that yesterday's conversation revealed, Elena corrected. Our values, our priorities, may be more divergent than either of us realized. That recognition requires reflection, not a hasty recommitment based on initial emotional reactions. The clinical precision of her analysis was quintessentially Elena, logical, practical, emotionally contained. Yet beneath it, Carlos sensed genuine pain, genuine confusion at discovering this fundamental difference between them after years of apparent harmony. Will you at least promise me this isn't a decision already made? He asked quietly, that you're genuinely taking time to reflect, not simply creating distance before ending our engagement? Elena's expression softened slightly. I promise, she said, reaching across to touch his hand briefly. I love you, Carlos. That hasn't changed. I just need to determine whether love is enough to bridge what seems like a significant gap in how we approach major life decisions. The qualification, seems like, offered a glimmer of hope that Carlos clung to desperately. Perhaps with distance, with reflection, Elena would recognize that their different approaches could complement rather than contradict each other. That his commitment to preserving his family's legacy didn't diminish his dedication to building their future together. What do we do now? He asked. Tonight, I mean. Elena's practical nature reasserted itself. I have some final packing to do. My ferry leaves early, so I should get some sleep soon. She hesitated, then added, unless you'd prefer I sleep in here tonight? It is our last night together for a while. The tentative offer caught Carlos by surprise. After the clinical precision of their earlier conversation, this gesture toward intimacy, toward connection despite their disagreement, seemed incongruous. Yet he found himself nodding, unwilling to relinquish even one night of their dwindling time together. I'd like that, he said simply. They prepared for bed with the familiar choreography of a long-term couple, moving around each other in practice patterns, the routine domestic intimacy a poignant contrast to the uncertainty hovering between them. In bed, Elena curled against him as she always did, her head on his shoulder, her hand resting over his heart. Carlos held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, the subtle fragrance of her moisturizer, cataloging sensory memories against the possibility of permanent loss. Whatever happens, Elena murmured, her voice already heavy with approaching sleep, I want you to know these 3 years have been the happiest of my life. The past tense sent a chill through Carlos despite the warm body pressed against his. Elena, he began, but she was already drifting off, her breathing deepening, her body relaxing into sleep with characteristic efficiency. Carlos remained awake long into the night, holding the woman he loved while their relationship hung in precarious balance. Outside, the stars wheeled slowly across the Aegean sky, indifferent to human concerns, human attachments, human choices. Carlos awoke to emptiness. The space beside him in the bed, warm with Elena's presence when he'd finally drifted off to sleep, was now cold and vacant. He reached out instinctively, his hand finding only rumpled sheets where her body should have been. For a moment, he existed in the liminal space between sleep and full consciousness, where reality hadn't yet reasserted itself. Then memory returned, sharp and clear as the Aegean sunlight streaming through the partially open curtains. Elena was leaving. Today. Now. He bolted upright, glancing at his watch. 6:47 a.m. Her ferry was scheduled to depart at 7. Had she already gone? Left without a final goodbye? The suite was silent, no sounds of movement from the bathroom or second bedroom. Carlos lit from the bed, pulling on a t-shirt as he moved quickly toward the second bedroom where Elena had stored her belongings. The door stood open, revealing strip beds and empty closets. In the bathroom, her toiletries were gone, the countertop wiped clean with characteristic thoroughness. A cold weight settled in Carlos's stomach. She had left without waking him, without a final word. After 3 years together, their relationship might have ended while he slept, unaware and unprepared. He returned to the main bedroom, reaching for his phone to call her, to demand an explanation for this final discourtesy. As he did, he noticed a folded piece of hotel stationery on her pillow. His name was written on the outside in Elena's precise handwriting. Carlos sat heavily on the edge of the bed, staring at the note for several long moments before unfolding it. Part of him didn't want to read whatever justification or explanation she'd left behind. Another part desperately needed to know her final thoughts, her parting words. Carlos, I considered waking you but thought perhaps a clean break would be easier for us both. Last night, holding you, feeling your warmth beside me, I almost reconsidered my decision to leave. But in the cold light of morning, I remain convinced that we need this time apart to evaluate what we truly want, what compromises we are, or aren't, willing to make. I've taken only essential items with me. The rest of my things are packed in my suitcase in the closet. You can bring them when you return to Madrid, or I can arrange to have them shipped if our separation becomes permanent. Please understand that this isn't solely about your grandmother's house. That situation merely illuminated something I believe we've both felt but haven't acknowledged, that despite our genuine love for each other, our fundamental approaches to life may be incompatible in ways that no amount of compromise can bridge. Take this time to truly consider what you want, without the pressure of my presence or expectations. I will be doing the same. With love, despite everything, Elena. Carlos read the note twice, searching for warmth, for regret, for any indication that Elena was acting against her true desires. He found only the same clear-eyed practicality that had characterized their conversation the previous day, a rational assessment of their situation and a logical response, emotions acknowledged but carefully contained. He moved to the terrace, notes still clutched in his hand, and gazed toward the harbor far below. A ferry was just pulling away from the dock, its white bulk gleaming in the early morning sun as it began its journey toward the horizon. Was Elena on board? Already watching Santorini recede, already mentally reorganizing her life without him at its center? The thought sent a wave of panic through him. He should have insisted on accompanying her to the harbor, should have made one last attempt to bridge the gulf between them, to find a compromise that honored both his family obligations and their shared future. Now it was too late. The ferry was underway, carrying Elena away from him with each passing moment. Carlos returned inside and called her mobile, needing to hear her voice, to ensure this wasn't truly the end. The call went straight to voicemail. Her phone was either turned off or out of service range. He tried again with the same result, then sent a text message that showed as undelivered. Frustration mingled with disbelief as he paced the suite. This wasn't how relationships ended, not relationships like theirs, built on 3 years of shared experiences, mutual respect, careful planning for a joint future. One disagreement, however significant, couldn't erase all they had built together. Elena would realize that. Given time and distance, she would recognize that their differences complemented rather than contradicted each other. She would come back. Wouldn't she? Doubt crept in, insidious and corrosive. Elena was nothing if not decisive. When she identified a problem, she addressed it directly, no procrastination, no wishful thinking, no emotional evasion. If she had determined the relationship was fundamentally flawed, she might indeed end it with the same efficient clarity with which she managed every other aspect of her life. Carlos showered mechanically, his mind circling the same questions without resolution. Afterward, he stood in the bathroom, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The man who gazed back at him looked tired, confused, somehow diminished, not the confident professor who had arrived in Santorini with his beautiful fiancée just over a week ago, not the man who had celebrated his 30th birthday surrounded by apparent perfection. That man had been living in a carefully constructed illusion, he now realized. The seamless partnership he'd believed in, the perfect compatibility he'd celebrated, all built on unexamined assumptions, on compromises neither had fully acknowledged. Carlos dressed and headed downstairs to the hotel's breakfast terrace. The hostess greeted him with the same bright smile as yesterday. "Good morning, Mr. Navarro. Just yourself today?" The question, identical to yesterday's, now carried painful significance. "Yes, just me. My fiancé had to return to Madrid early." "I'm sorry to hear that." The hostess's expression conveyed polite sympathy without intrusive curiosity. "Your usual table is available, if you'd like." Carlos nodded, following her to the small table overlooking the caldera where he and Elena had shared breakfast each morning of their vacation. Sitting alone felt wrong somehow, the empty chair crossed from him an accusatory presence. He ordered coffee but found himself unable to contemplate food. As the waiter departed, Carlos pulled out his phone again, checking for messages, for any communication from Elena. Nothing. He tried calling once more, with the same result, immediate voicemail, no connection. A new, disturbing thought occurred to him. What if something had happened to her? The ferry ride to Athens was generally safe, but accidents occurred. What if his last memory of Elena was watching her sleep beside him, unaware it would be the final time they shared such intimacy? Carlos forced himself to dismiss the morbid speculation. Elena was fine, simply maintaining the separation she believed they needed, the clean break she'd referenced in her note. She would contact him when she was ready, when she had processed her thoughts and reached whatever conclusion awaited at the end of her rational analysis. In the meantime, he was alone in Santorini with 7 days of their planned vacation remaining. 7 days in paradise, surrounded by honeymooning couples and stunning vistas that now seemed like elaborate mockeries of his circumstances. Carlos contemplated changing his return flight, following Elena back to Madrid immediately to continue their conversation in familiar surroundings. But what would that accomplish? She had made her desire for distance abundantly clear. Pursuing her now would only demonstrate an unwillingness to respect her wishes, potentially pushing her further away. No, he would remain in Santorini as planned. Use the time for his own reflection, his own assessment of what truly mattered to him. Elena wasn't the only one entitled to clarity through separation. After breakfast, Carlos returned to his suite, the emptiness of the space striking him anew. Elena's careful organization had left barely a trace of her presence, save for her suitcase stored neatly in the closet. Even the book she'd been reading was packed away, the bookmark precisely placed to indicate her progress. He moved to the desk where his journal lay unopened, the leather-bound volume a birthday gift from his grandmother the previous year. Carlos had maintained the habit of journaling since childhood, his grandmother impressing upon him the importance of documenting not just events but thoughts, feelings, the internal landscape that shaped one's response to external circumstances. Elena had always regarded this practice with tolerant amusement, much like his attachment to his grandfather's film camera, charming anachronism she accepted as part of his character. Now, Carlos opened the journal to a blank page and began to write, attempting to process the bewildering events of the past 48 hours. The words came haltingly at first, then in a rush as he detailed not just what had happened but his conflicted emotions, his uncertainty about the future, His struggle to reconcile his attachment to family heritage with his love for a woman who viewed that attachment as impractical sentimentality. The act of writing clarified his thoughts somewhat, though it provided no solutions. His grandmother's house remained the symbolic battlefield, not just between himself and Elena, but between competing aspects of his own identity. The academic who valued historical preservation, cultural continuity, tangible connections to the past. The man in love who had committed to building a future with a woman whose priorities now seemed at odds with his own. After an hour of writing, Carlos closed the journal, no closer to resolution but somehow calmer, the chaotic emotions of the morning contained within the written pages. He needed to leave the suite, to escape the oppressive emptiness of the space he'd expected to share with Elena for another week. Carlos gathered his grandfather's camera, a small map, and a water bottle, intending to explore parts of the island they hadn't yet visited, areas he could experience without constant reminders of Elena's absence. As he prepared to leave, his phone rang. He lunged for it, heart racing with hope that Elena had reconsidered, had reached out despite her declared need for separation. The screen displayed not Elena's name but his mother's. Carlos stared at it for a moment, momentarily disappointed yet also relieved to have contact with someone who knew him well, who might offer perspective on his situation. "Mama," he answered, attempting to keep his voice neutral. "How are you? How's Abuela?" "Carlos, my darling." His mother's warm voice wrapped around him like an embrace. "Your grandmother is doing much better. The doctors are pleased with her progress. They're talking about releasing her tomorrow or the day after." "That's wonderful news," Carlos said sincerely, genuine relief mingling with his personal turmoil. "She's been asking about you, about your birthday celebration." His mother hesitated briefly. "And about the house situation, of course." Carlos sank onto the edge of the bed. "I told her we'd discuss it when I returned to Spain. Nothing needs to be decided immediately." "Of course not," his mother agreed. "Though the developers are pressing for an answer. Their offer is time-limited, apparently." Another pause. "Carlos, is everything all right? You sound strained." He considered deflecting, preserving the image of the perfect Greek vacation his parents believed he was enjoying. But the need to confide in someone, to seek guidance from someone who knew him before Elena, who understood his connection to the family home, overwhelmed his instinct for privacy. "Elena left," he said simply. "This morning. She returned to Madrid early." "Left?" His mother's surprise was evident. "Why? Did something happen?" "We had a disagreement." Carlos struggled to encapsulate the complex situation succinctly. "About Abuela's house, actually. Elena thinks I should support selling it. She believes keeping it would be impractical, a financial burden that would impact our future together." "I see." His mother's tone was carefully neutral. "And you disagree?" "Of course I disagree," Carlos replied, a hint of frustration entering his voice. "It's our family home, Mama. 5 generations of Navarros have lived there. How can I simply agree to sell it off to developers who'll turn it into a boutique hotel for tourists?" His mother was silent for a moment before responding. "Your grandmother has always said the house would be yours someday, Carlos. She recognizes your special connection to it, your appreciation for its history. But she's also practical. She doesn't want the house to become a burden that prevents you from building your own life, your own future." "That's exactly what Elena said," Carlos noted with surprise. "That I'm clinging to the past at the expense of our future." "Perhaps there's some truth in that observation," his mother suggested gently. "Not that your attachment to the house isn't valid, it is. But maintaining a property of that size, that age, requires significant resources. Resources that might otherwise go toward your life with Elena, your future children, your own dreams." Carlos hadn't expected this perspective from his mother, who had always supported his connection to the family home, who had spent her own summers there as a young bride learning the house's rhythms from her mother-in-law. "Are you saying you think we should sell?" he asked, unable to keep the note of betrayal from his voice. "I'm saying there are no simple answers here," his mother replied. "Your father and I have discussed this at length. We understand the emotional significance of the house, its place in our family's history. We also recognize the practical challenges of maintaining it, especially as your grandmother ages and can no longer manage it herself. So what's the solution? Carlos pressed. Sell off our heritage for a one-time financial gain? There are alternatives between sell to developers and maintain exactly as is, his mother pointed out. Partial conversion to a museum or educational center, as you've mentioned before. A family trust arrangement where costs and responsibilities are shared. Donation to a historical preservation organization with provisions for family access. These were options Carlos had considered in his private thoughts, possibilities that preserve the house's integrity while addressing practical concerns. He had assumed Elena would reject such alternatives as impractical half-measures, but had he ever actually proposed them to her? Had he presented solutions, or merely defended his attachment without acknowledging her valid concerns? Have you discussed any of these alternatives with Elena? His mother asked, as if reading his thoughts. Not really, Carlos admitted. Our conversation moved very quickly from disagreement to questioning our compatibility. Elena believes the situation reveals a fundamental difference in our values, our approaches to life decisions. His mother sighed. Carlos, my son. I've known you your entire life. You have always been caught between two worlds, the tangible past you connect with so deeply and the future you work to build. It's what makes you an excellent historian, but also sometimes. She hesitated. Sometimes it makes practical decisions more challenging for you than they might be for others. You think Elena is right, Carlos concluded, a hollowness opening inside him. I think you both have valid perspectives, his mother corrected. And I think that true partnership requires finding common ground between those perspectives, not insisting that one must prevail completely over the other. Carlos was silent, absorbing this wisdom that seemed simultaneously obvious and revelatory. Have you told her about your plans for the house? His mother asked. The educational center concept you've mentioned to us? The preservation ideas you've researched? No, Carlos admitted. I was so focused on defending the principle that the house should remain in the family that I never got to the practical details of how that might work without burdening our future. Perhaps that's a conversation worth having, his mother suggested gently. When you're both ready. If she's willing to have it, Carlos added, doubt creeping into his voice. Elena was very clear about needing separation, about re-evaluating our compatibility. Elena is practical, not cold, his mother reminded him. She loves you, Carlos. One disagreement, however significant, doesn't erase that fact. Give her the space she's asked for, use this time to clarify your own thoughts, and then approach her with both understanding for her concerns and clear ideas for addressing them. The advice was sound, resonating with Carlos's own instincts beneath the panic and hurt of Elena's departure. They needed time, both of them, to process this unexpected rift, to determine whether it could be bridged or would remain an insurmountable divide. Thank you, Mama, he said sincerely. I needed to hear that. That's why mothers exist, my darling. Her tone lightened slightly. Now, what will you do with yourself in paradise while waiting for this storm to pass? Carlos glanced at his packed tea bag. Explore parts of the island I haven't seen yet. Think. Write in my journal. Try to gain some perspective. All excellent plans, his mother approved. And Carlos? Remember that both the past and the future matter, the trick is finding the balance between honoring one and building the other. After ending the call, Carlos felt marginally better, his mother's wisdom providing a framework for processing his situation. She was right, he needed to use this unexpected solitude for reflection, for clarifying his own thoughts before attempting to reconnect with Elena. He left the hotel, camera slung around his neck, and headed toward the ancient trail that connected Ferrer to Oya along the caldera's edge. The path was popular with tourists, offering spectacular views of the volcanic basin and the surrounding islands, but Carlos deliberately chose a time when foot traffic would be minimal, the late morning hours when most visitors were at the beaches or archaeological sites. The trail wound along the cliff's edge, alternately climbing and descending, passing through several small villages clustered like snowdrifts against the dark volcanic rock. Carlos walked slowly, pausing frequently to photograph particularly striking vistas through his grandfather's vintage lens. The physical exertion and creative focus provided temporary respite from his emotional turmoil, moments when composition and light occupied his full attention. Yet even as he walked, as he framed images in his viewfinder, Elena remained a persistent presence in his thoughts. He found himself mentally composing explanations, justifications, compromises he would offer when they next spoke. Scenarios played out in his imagination, Elena accepting his proposals for preserving the house while addressing her practical concerns, Elena rejecting any solution that didn't involve selling, Elena revealing that the house disagreement was merely a convenient exit point from a relationship she had already decided to end. The uncertainty was excruciating. Carlos had always prided himself on reading Elena accurately, on understanding her thoughts sometimes before she articulated them herself. Now he realized how presumptuous that belief had been. Her reaction to his grandmother's house situation had blindsided him completely, revealing aspects of her character, or at least her priorities, that he hadn't recognized in 3 years together. By mid-afternoon, Carlos had reached the outskirts of Oya, the picturesque village famous for its sunset views and distinctive blue-domed churches. The main street was crowded with tourists, forcing him to navigate carefully through the throng as he searched for a quiet spot to rest and rehydrate. He found a small cafe tucked away on a side street, its terrace offering views of the caldera without the congestion of the main tourist areas. Carlos ordered a Greek coffee and a small plate of meze, realizing he hadn't eaten since the previous evening. As he waited for his order, he checked his phone again, still no message from Elena, no indication she had even arrived safely in Athens. The lack of communication wasn't entirely surprising. Elena had been clear about needing space, a clean break to evaluate their situation independently. Still, the absence of even a brief confirmation of her safe arrival stung, a pointed reminder of the distance, emotional and physical, she had deliberately placed between them. Carlos ate mechanically, barely tasting the olives, feta, and dolmades arranged artfully on his plate. Around him, other patrons chatted happily, tourists exhilarated by their Greek adventure, locals conducting business with practiced efficiency. Normal life continuing while his remained suspended in uncertainty. After finishing his meal, Carlos decided to continue exploring Oya rather than immediately returning to Fira. The village's warren of narrow streets and hidden courtyards offered ample opportunity for both photography and distraction. He wandered without specific destination, allowing instinct to guide his path through the maze of whitewashed buildings and blue accents. In a quiet courtyard featuring a small gallery displaying local artists' work, Carlos paused to examine a series of paintings depicting Santorini's famous sunsets. The artist had captured not just the spectacular chromatic display but the quality of light itself, the way it transformed ordinary whitewashed walls into glowing canvases of gold and pink, the way it created dramatic shadows that accentuated the island's architectural forms. "They're quite remarkable, aren't they?" a female voice observed from beside him, the English words carrying a subtle accent Carlos couldn't immediately place. He turned to find a woman approximately his own age studying the paintings with evident appreciation. Her dark hair was gathered in a casual knot at the nape of her neck, her olive complexion suggesting Mediterranean heritage though not necessarily Greek. "Yes, they are," Carlos agreed. "The artist has captured something beyond just the visual appearance, there's an emotional quality to the light." The woman nodded, pleased by his observation. "Exactly. Anyone can paint a pretty sunset. Capturing how it feels to witness it, that's art." She extended her hand. "I'm Sophie, by the way. Sophie Delator. Carlos Navarro." He shook her offered hand briefly. "Are you a collector, or just browsing?" "A restorer, actually," Sophie replied. "I work with historical paintings in Athens, specializing in Byzantine religious works. But I have a weekend home here on Santorini, and I try to support local artists when I can." Her profession immediately interested Carlos, connecting to his own academic background in history. Religious art restoration must be fascinating work. The intersection of artistic technique, historical context, and spiritual significance. Sophie's expression brightened at his genuine interest. "It is, though most people's eyes glaze over when I start talking about pigment analysis and canvas deterioration patterns." Carlos laughed, the sound surprising him after the emotional weight of the past 2 days. I'm a history professor. Trust me, I understand the challenge of discussing academic passions with the general public. A kindred spirit, then. Sophie smiled. Are you here researching, or just enjoying the island? The question, innocuous as it was, brought Carlos's personal situation crashing back into focus. I was on vacation with my fiancée, he said, the past tense emerging unconsciously. She had to return to Madrid early. Business emergency. If Sophie noted the flicker of emotion that must have crossed his face, she gave no indication. Then you're exploring on your own now? Have you visited the archaeological museum? It's small but has some fascinating Minoan artifacts. Not yet, Carlos admitted. It's on my list, though. They close in about an hour, Sophie noted, checking her watch. But if you're interested in historical sites, there's a small Byzantine church ruin just outside the village that few tourists know about. The sunset view from there is spectacular, and you'd avoid the crowds that gather at the castle ruin. The suggestion of an obscure historical site immediately appealed to Carlos's academic interests, offering both distraction and genuine intellectual engagement. That sounds perfect, actually. Is it within walking distance? About 15 minutes from here, Sophie confirmed. I'm heading that direction myself to photograph the light on some architectural details for a restoration project. I'd be happy to show you the path. It's not well marked. Under normal circumstances, Carlos might have hesitated to accept such an offer from a stranger. But Sophie's professional background seemed legitimate, her manner straightforward rather than flirtatious, and the prospect of discovering an overlooked historical site while avoiding tourist crowds was deeply appealing. I'd appreciate that, he said simply. They left the gallery together, Sophie leading the way through Oil's labyrinthine streets with the confidence of familiarity. Their conversation flowed easily, focusing initially on Byzantine art history, a subject where their professional interests overlapped, before broadening to include observations about Santorini, the impact of tourism on historical preservation, and the challenges of balancing modern development with cultural heritage. This last topic inevitably reminded Carlos of his situation with Elena and his grandmother's house, though he carefully avoided mentioning these personal details to his new acquaintance. Still, something in his expression must have betrayed his thoughts, for Sophie glanced at him curiously as they left the village behind, following a narrow dirt path that wound along the caldera's edge. You seem preoccupied, she observed. Is everything all right? Carlos hesitated, uncertain how much to share with the stranger who was rapidly becoming a pleasant acquaintance. It's complicated, he said finally. A situation back home that's challenging. Sophie nodded, accepting his vague explanation without pressing further. Sometimes distance provides clarity, she offered. It's why I maintain my weekend home here, despite the impracticality. Athens stimulates the intellect, but Santorini calms the spirit. The sentiment resonated unexpectedly with Carlos's situation. Distance was precisely what Elena had sought, what they both perhaps needed, to gain clarity on their relationship, their priorities, their capacity for compromise on fundamental values. I hope you're right, he said quietly. They walked in companionable silence for several minutes, the path gradually ascending toward a rocky outcropping that jutted into the caldera. As they rounded a bend, a small stone structure came into view, the remains of a Byzantine church, its walls partially collapsed but still standing defiantly against time and elements. There it is, Sophie announced with evident satisfaction. The Church of Atos Nicolais. 12th century, though parts of the foundation may date to the 9th. It was abandoned after the 1650 volcanic event and never fully restored. Carlos approached the ruin with the reverence of a historian encountering tangible history. The church was small by modern standards but featured the distinctive Byzantine cruciform design, portions of faded frescoes still visible on the remaining interior walls. He circled the structure slowly, noting architectural details, evidence of various repair attempts over the centuries. The integration of the building with its dramatic landscape setting is extraordinary, he said finally, genuine enthusiasm breaking through his emotional preoccupation. The location, the preservation state, the historical continuity. Why isn't this site better known? Sophie smiled, pleased by his reaction. The local authorities prefer to keep it relatively unpublicized. Too many visitors would accelerate deterioration, and there aren't resources for proper conservation measures. Those who find it tend to be genuinely interested in the history, respectful of its fragility. Carlos nodded, understanding completely. It was a familiar dilemma in historical preservation, balancing accessibility against conservation, public education against physical protection of irreplaceable artifacts. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward his camera. Of course, Sophie agreed. Just avoid using flash if you move inside the structure. The remaining pigments are light-sensitive. Carlos spent the next hour photographing the church from various angles, documenting architectural details, the relationship between structure and landscape, the quality of light as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Sophie worked nearby, making detailed sketches of certain fresco elements, occasionally offering observations about Byzantine artistic techniques or structural conservation challenges. Their parallel activities established a comfortable rhythm, two professionals engaged in documenting history from different perspectives, sharing occasional insights without interrupting each other's concentration. For Carlos, the focus required by photography provided welcome respite from his emotional turmoil, while the historical significance of the site connected him to the academic passion that formed a core part of his identity. As the sun approached the horizon, setting the caldera ablaze with golden light, Sophie packed her sketching materials and moved to a flat rock near the cliff's edge. "Best view for the sunset," she explained, patting the space beside her in casual invitation. Carlos joined her, setting his camera aside to simply appreciate the spectacular natural display unfolding before them. The sun descended gradually, painting the sky in successive washes of gold, orange, pink, and finally deep purple as it slipped below the horizon. Across the caldera, the whitewashed buildings of Fair and other villages glowed like embers against the darkening volcanic rock. "I've seen a lot of sunsets," Sophie remarked quietly, "but Santorini's never failed to move me. There's something almost sacred about them, a daily reminder of beauty's ephemeral nature." Carlos nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. In that moment, watching day transition to night over the ancient caldera, his personal concerns seemed simultaneously diminished and clarified. The centuries-old church ruin behind them, the geological formation formed by volcanic cataclysm millennia ago, the rhythmic cycle of sunset and sunrise continuing regardless of human drama, all placed his situation with Elena in a larger context, neither dismissing its importance nor allowing it to consume his entire perspective. "Thank you for bringing me here," he said sincerely. "It was exactly what I needed today." Sophie smiled, her expression barely visible in the gathering dusk. "Sometimes we find what we need without realizing we were looking for it." She stood, brushing dust from her clothes. "We should head back before it gets completely dark. The path can be treacherous without proper light." They returned to awe and companionable silence, the village now transformed by evening illumination into a glittering cascade of lights against the dark cliff face. At the main square, they paused, their paths diverging. "My house is this way," Sophie explained, gesturing toward a side street. "Will you be alright finding transportation back to Fira? The buses run until midnight, or there are taxis at the main stand." "I'll manage," Carlos assured her. "Thank you again for today, for sharing that remarkable sight, and for—" He hesitated, uncertain how to express the unexpected gift of distraction and perspective she had provided. "For normal human interaction uncomplicated by personal history," Sophie suggested with perceptive humor. Carlos laughed, genuinely amused by her accurate assessment. "Exactly that. Sometimes strangers can be exactly the company we need." Sophie extended her hand. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Professor Navarro. If you're interested in other overlooked historical sites during your remaining time here, I've documented several for a preservation project. I'd be happy to share the information." Carlos accepted her hand, surprised by the offer but appreciative of it. "I would like that, actually. I have several more days on the island and could use the distraction and the historical education." They exchanged contact information, Sophie promising to email her documented sites with brief historical context and practical visiting information. The interaction remained refreshingly uncomplicated, two professionals with shared interests establishing a casual connection, no emotional complexities or unstated expectations. The return journey to Fair gave Carlos time to reflect on the day's unexpected turn. What had begun as an attempt to escape his emotional turmoil had evolved into a genuinely enriching experience, not just the discovery of the Byzantine church ruin, but the easy professional camaraderie he'd established with Sophie. For the first time since Elena's departure, he had spent several hours without his thoughts constantly circling back to the painful uncertainty of his relationship. The bus wound its way along Santorini's dramatic coastal roads, lights from scattered villages twinkling against the dark volcanic landscape. Carlos gazed out the window, noting how different the island appeared at night, still beautiful, but in a more mysterious, contemplative way that suited his current mood. When he reached the hotel, he checked his phone again out of habit. Still no message from Elena, though by now she would have reached Athens and likely made her connection to Madrid. The absence of even a brief text confirming her safe arrival spoke volumes about her commitment to the clean break she had deemed necessary. Carlos found himself strangely calmer about this silence than he had been earlier in the day. Perhaps his mother's advice had taken root, or perhaps the historical perspective gained at the Byzantine ruin had provided some emotional distance from his immediate situation. Whatever the reason, he felt more capable of respecting Elena's need for space, of using this time for his own reflection rather than desperately seeking reassurance. In his suite, he downloaded the photographs from his grandfather's camera to his laptop, the familiar ritual providing a sense of continuity amid disruption. The images of the church ruin had captured something essential about the site, not just its physical form but its resilience, its dignity despite partial collapse, its continued significance despite centuries of abandonment. As he reviewed the photographs, a parallel began to form in Carlos's mind. His grandmother's house, like the Byzantine church, represented more than stone and mortar. It embodied cultural continuity, historical witness, a physical manifestation of time's passage. Yet unlike the church ruin, the house remained a living entity, adaptable to new purposes while maintaining its essential character. This thought sparked an idea that had hovered at the edges of his consciousness since his conversation with his mother. What if the house could be preserved not as a static monument to the past but as a dynamic bridge between heritage and future utility? Not merely maintained as a private family residence but partially open to wider appreciation and use? Carlos opened his journal and began sketching concepts, ideas flowing with unexpected clarity. A portion of the house maintained as private family quarters. Another section developed as a small museum showcasing its historical significance and the Navarro family's contributions to Toledo's cultural life. Perhaps educational programs for local children, teaching them about architectural conservation and regional history. Maybe even limited, curated accommodation for travelers seeking authentic historical experiences rather than generic hotel stays. The financial model began to take shape as well. Historical preservation grants from European cultural institutions. Modest revenue from educational programs and selective accommodation. Family contributions proportional to usage rights. Potentially even a partnership with the university where Carlos taught, creating a satellite location for specialized historical research or summer courses. The more Carlos developed these ideas, the more viable they seemed, not merely romantic notions but practical solutions that could address Elena's legitimate concerns while preserving the house's integrity and significance. Why hadn't he articulated these possibilities during their discussion? Why had he defaulted to a binary opposition? Keep the house exactly as it was or sell it completely, when creative alternatives existed. He worked late into the night, filling pages with increasingly detailed plans, researching relevant grant programs on his laptop, drafting budgetary estimates based on his knowledge of the house's condition and maintenance requirements. The focused productivity felt therapeutic, channeling his emotional energy into concrete problem-solving rather than circular worry. Around 2 in the morning, Carlos received an email notification. For a brief, hopeful moment, he thought it might be from Elena. Instead, it was from Sophie, containing a detailed document titled Santorini's Hidden Historical Sites with photographs, historical context, access information, and conservation notes for a dozen locations across the island. I hope these might provide both intellectual stimulation and pleasant distraction during your remaining time on Santorini, she had written. The third site on the list, an Ottoman period cistern near Megalochori, particularly connects to Spanish Moorish architectural influences you might find interesting given your background. The thoughtful, professional gesture touched Carlos deeply. In the midst of personal turmoil, this casual acquaintance had taken time to share specialized knowledge that aligned with his interests, offering not empty sympathy but substantive engagement with the academic passion that formed a core part of his identity. Carlos sent a brief but sincere reply thanking Sophie for her generosity, expressing particular interest in the Ottoman cistern she had highlighted. Perhaps I could buy you coffee as thanks if our paths cross again during my stay, he added, the invitation deliberately casual, professional rather than personal. He closed his laptop and prepared for bed, exhaustion finally overtaking the nervous energy that had fueled his productive evening. As he drifted towards sleep, Carlos felt cautiously optimistic for the first time since Elena's departure. Not about the relationship necessarily, there remained a painful uncertainty, but about his capacity to address the house situation with both emotional intelligence and practical creativity, to potentially bridge the gap between his attachment to heritage and Elena's concern for their future. Whether Elena would be receptive to these solutions remained an open question, but developing them had clarified something essential for Carlos. His commitment to his family's legacy wasn't merely sentimental obstinacy but a core value that could be expressed in pragmatic, forward-looking ways. If Elena couldn't accept that aspect of his identity, perhaps they truly were incompatible, despite their genuine love for each other. The thought brought a different kind of pain, not the sharp anguish of unexpected separation but the duller ache of recognizing a fundamental truth long obscured by compatible daily routines and shared practical goals. Carlos awoke the next morning to bright Aegean sunshine streaming through partially open curtains. He had slept deeply despite his late night, the emotional and physical exhaustion of the previous days finally claiming their due. For a brief, disorienting moment, he reached for Elena before remembering her absence, the reality of their situation. The instinctive gesture reinforced how deeply their lives had intertwined over 3 years together. Countless small habits, expectations, shared references that constituted a joint existence beyond the major plans and explicit agreements. Rebuilding daily life without those interwoven patterns would be challenging, should their separation become permanent, a prospect Carlos still couldn't fully contemplate despite its growing plausibility. He checked his phone. Still no message from Elena, though he hadn't truly expected one. She had been clear about needing space, about making a clean break to evaluate their situation independently. Carlos respected that boundary, though maintaining it required considerable restraint. After showering and dressing, he reviewed the material Sophie had sent, identifying several sites he wanted to visit during his remaining time on the island. The Ottoman cistern near Megalochori particularly intrigued him, both for its architectural significance and its relative isolation from tourist routes. At breakfast on the hotel terrace, Carlos found himself more able to appreciate his surroundings than he had been yesterday morning. The magnificent caldera view, the perfect Greek coffee, the simple pleasure of fresh fruit in the morning sunshine, small joys that had been obscured by emotional distress now reasserted their value, if not with their original potency, then at least with recognizable appeal. As he finished his meal, Carlos received a text message. His heart leapt before he saw it was from his mother rather than Elena. Your grandmother is being released today. She's insisting on returning to the house rather than staying with us in Madrid. Your father and I will accompany her. How are you, my darling? Carlos replied, conveying genuine pleasure at his grandmother's recovery while avoiding details about his own situation. He mentioned exploring historical sites, working on some writing, enjoying the island's beauty, all technically true if significantly edited. I've been thinking about the house, he added. I have some ideas to discuss when I return, approaches that might preserve its significance while addressing practical concerns about its future. His mother's response came quickly, your grandmother will be delighted to hear that. She worries about burdening you with an obligation rather than gifting you a legacy. Call when you can, she would love to hear your voice. Carlos promised to call that evening, when his grandmother would be settled back at home. The exchange left him feeling more connected to his family, more secure in his understanding of the house situation. His grandmother's concern about the house becoming a burden rather than a blessing mirrored Elena's practical objections, suggesting that solutions addressing those concerns might satisfy both the family's patriarch and his fiancée, if Elena was still open to compromise, to finding middle ground between their divergent perspectives. After breakfast, Carlos gathered his camera, notebook, and Sophie's guide to hidden historical sites, heading out to explore Megalochori and the Ottoman cistern. The village lay in Santorini's interior, away from the caldera views that drew most tourists, offering a more authentic glimpse of island life alongside significant architectural heritage. The local bus delivered him to Megalochori's main square, a charming space surrounded by traditional buildings, a few tavernas preparing for lunchtime service, and locals going about their daily business with little concern for the occasional visitor. Carlos oriented himself using Sophie's detailed directions, following narrow streets that wound between whitewashed houses adorned with bougainvillea and blue-painted doors. The cistern lay at the village's edge, partially concealed by a hillside and accessible via a narrow path that showed minimal signs of visitor traffic. As Sophie had noted in her guide, the structure appeared unimpressive at first glance, a low stone building with a domed roof, its exterior weathered by centuries of sun and salt air. The entrance was secured by a metal gate, but as Sophie had indicated, the caretaker who held the key could usually be found at a nearby house. Carlos approached the modest dwelling and knocked, his limited Greek supplemented by Sophie's name as introduction. An elderly man with weather-lined features opened the door, nodding in recognition at Sophie's name and Carlos's simple Greek greeting. He retrieved a large iron key, gesturing for Carlos to follow him to the cistern. No entrance fee was requested, though Carlos offered a donation for maintenance that the caretaker accepted with dignified appreciation. The interior of the cistern revealed why Sophie had included it in her guide. What appeared unremarkable from outside contained a marvel of engineering and aesthetics within. A forest of stone columns supported the domed ceiling, their capitals carved with motifs that blended Byzantine, Ottoman, and indeed Moorish influences. The space was cool and dimly lit by narrow apertures in the dome, creating dramatic shafts of light that moved across the interior as the sun traversed the sky. The acoustic properties were equally remarkable, a whisper at one end carried clearly to the other, while footsteps created complex echoes that seemed to converse with each other. Carlos spent over an hour documenting the space with his camera, making notes about the architectural details that connected to similar structures in Spain, experiencing the contemplative atmosphere that such spaces naturally engendered. When he finally emerged, blinking in the bright afternoon sunshine, the caretaker had returned to his home. Carlos locked the gate and returned the key with thanks, adding another donation that was accepted with the same dignified nod. He found a small, family-run taverna in the village square for a late lunch, ordering a simple meal of grilled fish, local vegetables, and a glass of Assyrtiko wine produced from grapes grown in Santorini's volcanic soil. As he ate, Carlos reviewed his photographs of the cistern, particularly struck by the way cultures had blended in its design, Byzantine structural elements, Ottoman spatial concepts, decorative details that echoed across the Mediterranean from Spain to Greece. The cistern embodied the reality that cultural heritage was never pure or static but always hybrid, adaptive, incorporating influences across geographical and temporal boundaries. This perspective reinforced Carlos's evolving ideas about his grandmother's house, not as a museum piece frozen in time but as a living entity that could incorporate new purposes while maintaining its essential character and significance. After lunch, Carlos explored the rest of Megalochori, discovering a small Byzantine church with remarkable frescoes, hidden courtyards where village life continued unchanged for generations, architectural details that told stories of prosperity, decline, and resilience across centuries. He photographed not just the obvious historical features but everyday moments, an elderly woman hanging laundry against a centuries-old wall, children playing in a square their ancestors had occupied for generations, a craftsman repairing a traditional wooden door with techniques unchanged for centuries. These images of continuity amid change, of heritage actively inhabited rather than merely preserved, crystallized something essential in Carlos's thinking about his grandmother's house. Its value lay not just in its physical structure or historical pedigree but in its capacity to connect generations, to provide living continuity rather than fossilized remembrance. By late afternoon, He had filled a memory card with photographs and several notebook pages with observations and ideas. Rather than returning immediately to Farah, Carlos found a small cafe with a terrace overlooking vineyards that stretched toward the sea. He ordered coffee and opened his journal, beginning to synthesize the day's experiences and insights, connecting them to his evolving plans for the house. As he wrote, his phone rang, an unknown Greek number. Curiosity prompted him to answer. "Carlos? It's Sophie Delator." Her voice carried a hint of apology for the unexpected contact. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," he assured her, genuinely pleased by the connection. "I've just spent the afternoon exploring Megalochori and the Ottoman cistern you recommended. Remarkable place, exactly the kind of architectural fusion that fascinates me academically." "I thought you might appreciate it," Sophie replied, satisfaction evident in her tone. "The reason I'm calling, I've unexpectedly received access to a private Byzantine chapel near Pyrgos that's rarely open to visitors. The family that owns it is having some conservation assessment done for insurance purposes, and I've been asked to provide consultation. I thought you might be interested in accompanying me, given your historical background and our conversation yesterday." The invitation was professionally framed, clearly an extension of their shared academic interests rather than a personal overture. Still, Carlos hesitated briefly, accepting would mean deeper connection with this new acquaintance while his relationship with Elena remained unresolved. Was that appropriate? Was he overthinking a simple professional courtesy? "That sounds fascinating," he said finally, setting aside unnecessary complications. "When would this visit occur?" "Tomorrow morning, if that works for your schedule," Sophie replied. "The family has granted access from 9 until noon, after which they have other commitments." "Tomorrow morning would be perfect," Carlos confirmed. "Where shall I meet you?" They arranged a meeting point in Pyrgos, Sophie promising to send detailed directions via text message. The conversation remained brief and practical, focused entirely on the upcoming site visit without personal inquiries or superfluous chat. After ending the call, Carlos returned to his journal, documenting this unexpected development alongside his other observations. The opportunity to view a private Byzantine chapel aligned perfectly with his academic interests, potentially providing insights relevant to portions of his grandmother's house that dated from the same period. That Sophie had thought to include him spoke to her professional generosity and her accurate assessment of his historical passions. By early evening, Carlos had returned to Farah, his mind filled with the day's experiences and observations. As promised, he called his grandmother, finding her settled back in the Toledo house, her voice stronger than during their previous conversation though still carrying traces of her recent illness. "My Carlos," she greeted him warmly. "How is beautiful Santorini treating you?" He described his explorations in general terms, focusing on historical sites and cultural observations rather than his personal situation. His grandmother listened attentively, occasionally interjecting memories from her own visit to the island decades earlier with Carlos's grandfather. "Your mother mentioned you've been thinking about possibilities for the house," she said eventually, steering the conversation toward the topic that hovered between them. Carlos took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. "I have, Abuela. I don't believe we need to choose between preserving the house's significance and addressing practical concerns about its future. There are creative approaches that could accomplish both." "Tell me," his grandmother encouraged, genuine interest in her voice. Carlos outlined his evolving ideas, maintaining a portion of the house for family use while developing other sections for educational purposes, potential partnerships with cultural institutions, financial models that combine family contributions with external funding and modest revenue generation. The house has always adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character, he concluded. This would be another evolution, not a betrayal of its history but an extension of it into the future. His grandmother was silent for a moment after he finished speaking. "You've given this considerable thought," she observed finally. "More than I expected when your mother mentioned you had ideas." "I have," Carlos acknowledged. "The house matters deeply to me, Abuela, not just as a physical structure but as everything it represents, our family's history, the continuity between generations, the tangible connection to our past." I want to find a way to preserve that significance while ensuring it doesn't become an impractical burden on anyone's future. Including your future with Elena, his grandmother added perceptively. Carlos hesitated, uncertain how much his parents had shared about his current situation. Elena has practical concerns about the house, he said carefully. Valid concerns that deserve serious consideration. But she isn't there with you now, his grandmother observed, her decades of accumulated wisdom allowing her to read between the lines. Something has happened between you. Carlos sighed, recognizing the futility of concealment from this woman who had known him his entire life. We had a disagreement about the house, he admitted, about what it represents, about its place in our future together. Elena returned to Madrid early to reconsider our compatibility. Oh, my dear boy. His grandmother's voice carried deep compassion without judgment. I never intended the house to become a source of division between you. It's not the house itself, Carlos tried to explain. It's what the disagreement revealed about our different values, our approaches to decisions that involve both practical considerations and emotional attachments. I understand more than you might think, his grandmother replied. Your grandfather and I had similar conflicts early in our marriage. He was much like you, deeply connected to heritage, to the tangible manifestations of family history. I was more practical, more focused on building our future than preserving the past. This revelation surprised Carlos. In his childhood memories, his grandparents had seemed perfectly aligned in their reverence for family tradition, their commitment to preserving the house and everything it represented. How did you resolve those differences? He asked, suddenly hungry for insight that might apply to his own situation. Time, his grandmother answered simply. Experience. Mutual respect for each other's perspectives. I gradually came to appreciate the value of what your grandfather cherished, while he learned to consider practical realities alongside emotional attachments. She paused. And love, of course. Not the romantic fantasy that everything would somehow work out perfectly, but the daily decision to prioritize our connection above individual preferences. Do you think Elena and I can find that balance? Carlos asked, vulnerability evident in his voice. That depends on both of you, his grandmother replied honestly. On whether your love is strong enough to accommodate fundamental differences in how you approach life's decisions. On whether you can truly hear each other's concerns without dismissing them as irrational or unimportant. The wisdom in her words resonated deeply with Carlos, echoing his mother's advice while adding the perspective of someone who had navigated similar challenges successfully. Thank you, Abuela, he said sincerely. For everything, your insights, your understanding about the house, your example of finding balance between honoring the past and building the future. The house is important, Carlos, his grandmother replied. But not as important as the people who inhabit it, who give it meaning beyond stone and mortar. Remember that, whatever you decide. After ending the call, Carlos felt simultaneously comforted and challenged by his grandmother's words. Her revelation about early conflicts with his grandfather offered hope that divergent perspectives could find reconciliation over time. Yet her emphasis on mutual respect and genuine understanding set a high standard for the conversations he and Elena would need to have when, if, she was ready to re-engage. Carlos spent the evening reviewing and organizing his photographs from the day's explorations, developing his notes into more detailed plans for the house, and preparing questions for the Byzantine chapel visit with Sophie the following morning. The focused productivity provided welcome distraction from the emotional uncertainty that still hovered at the edges of his consciousness. Before sleeping, he checked his phone one final time, still no message from Elena, now almost 48 hours since her departure. Carlos resisted the impulse to contact her, respecting her clearly stated need for space and independent reflection. Instead, he sent a brief text to his mother, updating her on his conversation with his grandmother and expressing genuine pleasure at her return home. She sounds stronger than I expected, he wrote. The house clearly provides comfort beyond its practical function as shelter, another aspect of its value that's difficult to quantify but no less real. His mother's reply came quickly. The house has always been her anchor, her connection to your grandfather and generations before him. Places can hold meaning beyond their material existence, becoming repositories for memory and identity. I think you understand that better than most. The observation struck Carlos with unexpected force. He did understand that truth, had built an academic career around exploring how physical spaces and objects carried cultural significance beyond their utilitarian functions. Yet he had struggled to articulate this understanding to Elena, defaulting instead to emotional assertions about family obligation and tradition that she could easily dismiss as impractical sentimentality. If, when they spoke again, he would need to express his perspective more effectively, helping her understand that his attachment to the house wasn't merely emotional obstinacy but connected to core values that informed his entire worldview. Whether that would bridge the divide between them remained uncertain, but clarity about the fundamental nature of their difference might at least provide a starting point for genuine dialogue. Carlos fell asleep with this determination in mind, his dreams filled with Byzantine domes, Moorish arches, and stone walls that somehow spoke with his grandmother's voice, reminding him that structures endured while people passed, that the value of heritage lay not in its preservation but in its transmission, its capacity to connect generations across time's relentless passage. He awoke early the next morning, surprisingly refreshed despite the emotional and intellectual intensity of recent days. The sky outside his terrace promised another perfect Santorini day, clear blue expanse stretching to the horizon, early morning light casting long shadows across the caldeira's dramatic topography. Carlos prepared for his appointment with Sophie, selecting comfortable clothing suitable for exploring a historic site while maintaining the professional appearance appropriate for meeting the chapel's owners. He packed his camera, notebook, and a small measuring tape that might prove useful for documenting architectural details. As he was about to leave the suite, his phone chimed with an incoming email notification. Carlos checked it automatically, expecting hotel correspondence or perhaps additional information from Sophie about their meeting. Instead, he found a message from Elena, her first communication since the brief note left on her pillow 2 mornings ago. Carlos stared at the notification, suddenly uncertain whether to open it immediately or wait until he returned from the Byzantine chapel visit, when he could give it his full attention. Curiosity and emotional need won out over strategic consideration. Carlos opened the email, his heart racing with anticipation and apprehension. Carlos, I've arrived safely in Madrid and have had time to begin processing our situation. First, I want to apologize for the abruptness of my departure. While I still believe we needed separation to gain perspective, I could have handled it with more consideration for your feelings. These past 2 days have been difficult. I've found myself reaching for you instinctively, to share an observation, to ask your opinion, to simply feel your presence beside me. Our lives have become so interwoven that separation creates unexpected voids in the most ordinary moments. I've also been reflecting deeply on our disagreement about your grandmother's house and what it revealed about our different approaches to major life decisions. I stand by my core concern that practical considerations must factor significantly into choices that impact our future together. But perhaps I was too quick to frame our difference as irreconcilable too binary in my assessment of the situation. My colleague Julia suggested something that resonated with me. She asked whether I was truly upset about the house itself or about what your attachment to it represented, a sense that your connection to your family's past might always take precedence over our shared future. I'm still processing this question, still searching for clarity about what truly matters to me in the situation. I'm not ready to suggest a path forward yet. I need more time to understand my own reactions, to determine whether our different values truly prevent the partnership I believed we were building. But I wanted you to know that I'm engaged in this reflection, that I haven't simply dismissed our relationship as unsalvageable. I hope you're finding some peace amid what must be a difficult time. If you've come to clarity about your own position, I would welcome hearing it, not as a negotiation or attempt to resolve our situation immediately, but as part of the honest communication that has always been a strength between us. Take care of yourself, Carlos. Despite everything, I do love you. Elena. Carlos read the message twice, absorbing its measured tone, its careful balance between emotional honesty and continued uncertainty. Relief surged through him, not because their situation was resolved but because Elena was genuinely reflecting rather than simply withdrawing, considering nuance rather than maintaining the binary framing of their initial disagreement. Her colleague's observation particularly struck him, The notion that Elena's reaction might concern not the house itself but what his attachment to it symbolized about his priorities. This perspective aligned with his own recent insights about needing to articulate the values underlying his position, to help Elena understand that his connection to heritage wasn't merely sentimental but fundamental to his identity and worldview. Carlos wanted to respond immediately, to share his evolving thoughts about creative approaches to the house situation, to express his own continued love despite their current uncertainty, but a glance at his watch reminded him of his appointment with Sophie. The Byzantine chapel visit represented a professional commitment he shouldn't casually reschedule, particularly given Sophie's generosity in including him. He would reply to Elena this evening, after he had processed her message more fully and could respond with the thoughtfulness it deserved. For now, knowing she remained engaged with their relationship, open to continued communication and potential reconciliation, provided emotional sustenance he hadn't realized how desperately he needed. Carlos left the hotel with lighter steps than he had taken since Elena's departure, heading toward his meeting with Sophie and the rare opportunity to explore a private Byzantine chapel. The day had offered both intellectual stimulation and emotional space, time to absorb Elena's message while engaging with the historical passion that formed a core part of his identity. As he walked through Fair's narrow streets toward the bus station, Carlos felt the first genuine hope since their painful conversation at Moody Bay. Not certainty that the relationship would survive this challenge, but possibility, the space between alternatives where solutions might emerge from genuine understanding and mutual respect for different but equally valid perspectives. Whether he and Elena could navigate this space successfully remained uncertain, but uncertainty contained potential as well as risk. The potential for deeper connection through honest engagement with fundamental differences, for a relationship strengthened rather than weakened by the recognition of divergent values and the commitment to honoring both.